My name is Tabitha Graham. I am 32 years old and an attending physician at a premier trauma center in Maryland. 5 years ago, my younger sister Paige looked my parents in the eye and told them I had dropped out of medical school. She claimed I was using my tuition money to fund a severe narcotics habit. It was a calculated fiction, designed to eliminate me as competition for their financial support so she could fund her own lifestyle startup. They believed her, without asking for a single transcript. They did not call my university. They did not ask for a drug test. They simply severed all ties. They canceled my tuition checks mid-semester. They blocked my phone number. They did not attend my residency graduation. They did not show up to my wedding. For 5 long years, I ceased to exist in their world. I survived on cafeteria leftovers and predatory loans, working 80-hour weeks until my hands shook and my vision blurred, building my life brick by brick entirely on my own. Then last Tuesday at 11:42 at night, the trauma doors of my Baltimore emergency room blasted open. A 25-year-old woman was wheeled in, bleeding out from a high-speed car crash. The nurses paged the attending physician to save her life. When my mother and father arrived in the waiting room and saw the name embroidered on the white coat of the doctor holding their golden child's fate in her hands, my mother grabbed my father's arm so hard it left dark purple bruises. Before we dive into exactly what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the Amanda Told Stories channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your age, your location, and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now, to understand the sheer weight of that night in the trauma bay, you need to step into the chaos of my emergency room. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine, I called out over the blaring alarms. The Baltimore Trauma Center operated on controlled chaos, a high-stakes ballet where fractions of a second dictated survival. Outside, a thick fog was rolling off the Chesapeake Bay, blanketing the city in a damp chill. But inside Bay 3, the air was sharp with the scent of antiseptic, adrenaline, and iron. Before the ambulance doors had even swung open, I stood at the head of the empty bed, folding a strip of silk medical tape back on itself to create a neat tab. It was a precise grounding habit drilled into me by my favorite residency director years ago. "Always prep your tape, Graham," he used to say. "When the bleeding starts, you will not have time to pick at the edges." Paramedics crashed through the entrance, maneuvering a gurney slick with crimson. Jane Doe, mid-20s, the lead EMT rattled off his chest, heaving as they locked the stretcher into place. High-speed motor vehicle collision. Vehicle wrapped around a concrete median on Interstate 95. Heart rate is thready, peaking at 140. Pressure is tanking, 80 over palp. Breath sounds absent on the right side. I tossed the prepared tape onto the sterile tray and stepped into the fray, snapping my gloves tight. "Get her on the monitor. I need 2 large-bore IVs. Start the rapid infuser with O-negative blood. We need a chest tube set up right now." The overhead fluorescent lights beat down mercilessly, casting harsh shadows across the patient's face, which was currently a grim mask of shattered safety glass and deep lacerations. Her breathing was a wet, ragged gasp. I grabbed a pair of trauma shears, methodically slicing through the ruined fabric of what looked like a designer silk blouse, ruined by the impact. "Blood is hanging," my lead nurse Elias announced, moving with his usual practiced efficiency. "Good. I need to secure this airway before she crashes," I replied, reaching for the metal handle of the laryngoscope. I grabbed a sterile gauze pad, leaning over the head of the bed to wipe away the thick, pooling blood obstructing her mouth and nose. One swipe across the jawline, another across the forehead, clearing the debris. My hand froze midair. The clinical detachment I had spent a decade building fractured in a single deafening heartbeat. Beneath the jagged cuts lay a bone structure I knew better than my own. A sharp, familiar jawline, a distinctive slight curve of the bridge of the nose. Even beneath the grime, the expensive balayage hair color clung to strands matted with drying blood. It was Paige, my younger sister. The sister I had not spoken to in 5 years. The sister who had looked me in the eye and spun a fiction so toxic it burned my life to ash while our parents eagerly handed her the matches. The heart monitor suddenly shrieked an erratic, high-pitched warning of ventricular tachycardia. Dr. Graham Elias prompted, his voice cutting through the sudden ringing in my ears. He was holding the endotracheal tube, his eyes locked on mine, waiting for the command. For a microsecond, the sterile room vanished. I was back in our parents' pristine kitchen in Annapolis, standing on the cold hardwood floor, listening to this very girl tell them I was a failure, a liability, a lost cause. I remembered the exact shade of her lip gloss that day, the slight smirk she wore when my father told me to pack my bags. I remembered the hunger pangs during my 3rd year of medical school, the nights I slept in my car because I could not afford rent, the suffocating weight of the loans I had to sign just to keep my dream alive. Then the muscle memory of 10,000 shifts took over. I swallowed the ghost of my past, forcing my pulse to steady. I was an attending physician. I did not have the luxury of grief in this room. I only treated it. "Hand me the tube," I ordered, my voice dropping an octave, dead calm. "Let's keep her alive." I tilted her head back, sliding the blade of the laryngoscope past her tongue, lifting the tissue to expose the vocal cords. It was a textbook intubation, executed with a cold precision that betrayed none of the storm raging in my chest. Elias handed me the tube, and I guided it smoothly into place, pulling the stylet and attaching the bag valve mask. "I'm in," I said. "Check breath sounds." Elias placed his stethoscope over her chest, squeezing the bag. Good bilateral breath sounds. Oxygen saturations are coming up. Keep bagging her. I'm placing the chest tube. I moved to her right side, grabbing the scalpel. My hands, which had trembled just moments before with the shock of recognition, were now steady as stone. I made the incision between her ribs, inserted the clamp, and guided the plastic tube into her pleural space. A rush of dark blood and trapped air hissed into the collection canister. Her blood pressure slowly began to climb out of the danger zone. She was stabilizing. The immediate threat of death was retreating, leaving behind the stark, terrifying reality of who was lying on my table. As the trauma team worked around me, securing lines, drawing labs, and prepping her for the inevitable trip to the operating room, I stepped back. I peeled off my bloody gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin. The adrenaline that had carried me through the initial code was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, heavy dread settling in the pit of my stomach. I looked at her face again. The swelling was already starting distorting her features, but there was no mistaking her. The last time I saw her, she was wearing a cashmere sweater our mother bought her, holding a glass of champagne celebrating the launch of a business that did not exist. Now she was broken, reliant on machines to breathe and entirely at my mercy. Dr. Graham, the charge nurse, called out from the doorway. "Police are outside. They ran the plates on the wrecked vehicle. They have an identification." "I know who she is," I said, my voice eerily quiet. The charge nurse paused, a frown creasing her forehead. "You know her?" "Yes." I grabbed a fresh pair of gloves from the wall dispenser, snapping them on. "Page General Surgery. Tell them we have a shattered pelvis and probable internal bleeding. She needs an operating room right now." "And her family?" the nurse asked gently. "Should we have the police contact her next of kin?" I looked at the heart monitor, watching the steady, rhythmic spikes of the life I had just saved. I thought about my parents, asleep in their comfortable bed in Annapolis, oblivious to the fact that their golden child was currently clinging to life by a thread, and that the daughter they threw away was the only reason that thread had not snapped. "Call them," I said, turning my back on the bed to update the electronic chart. "Tell them to get here fast." It was 1:15 in the morning when the surgical team finally rolled Paige out of the trauma bay and up to the operating room. I stood by the empty metal bed for a long moment, watching the red taillights of the transport monitors fade down the hallway. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the code was beginning to leave my system, replaced by a deep, aching fatigue that settled directly into my bones. The floor beneath my rubber clogs was slick with discarded medical packaging and the remnants of the fight to keep my sister alive. My scrubs, usually a pristine hospital blue, were spattered in dark, rust-colored stains. My own sister's blood was currently drying on my forearms. I walked over to the corner scrub sink and turned the water on, letting the freezing stream hit my skin. I lathered my hands, my wrists, my forearms, watching the pink foam spiral down the stainless steel drain. I grabbed a rough paper towel and wiped my face, but I deliberately chose not to change my clothes. I wanted them to see it. I wanted my parents to see exactly what it took to pull their favorite child back from the edge of the grave. The corridors of the hospital at this hour possess a specific kind of quiet. It is not peaceful. It is the tense, hollow silence of people waiting for terrible news, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional beep of a telemetry monitor. I moved down the long hallway toward the family consultation wing, my steps echoing faintly against the polished linoleum. The charge nurse had placed Charles and Linda in room B, a small, windowless space with muted lighting, 2 uncomfortable gray sofas, and a box of tissues strategically placed in the center of a glass coffee table. I stopped just outside the closed wooden door, looking through the narrow, vertical glass panel. There they were. 5 years had aged them, but the inherent entitlement remained etched into every line of their posture. Linda was pacing the short length of the room. Her phone was clutched tightly to her chest, her designer trench coat wrinkled and hastily thrown over a pair of pajamas. Charles stood near the far wall, staring blankly at a generic painting of a sailboat. He looked diminished. The broad, intimidating shoulders I remembered from my childhood were slumped, carrying a heavy, invisible weight. And then my eyes locked onto his collar. I saw the tie. It was a Maryland state flag print, a bold, geometric pattern of black and gold checkers clashing against red and white crosses. It was visibly frayed at the edges now, the cheap silk unraveling, stained with a dark splash of what looked like old coffee near the knot. It was the exact same tie he wore to Paige's high school graduation. The sight of that pattern pulled me backward in time. That graduation was the same afternoon they summoned me into the pristine, granite-covered kitchen of our Annapolis home. That was the day Paige, wearing her graduation gown and a smug smile, spun her intricate web of lies, claiming my medical school tuition was going straight into my veins. Charles had worn that exact tie, standing tall, his voice booming with patriarchal authority as he ordered me to leave my house keys on the kitchen island. He had adjusted that bright, proud knot right before he told me I was a disgrace, choosing the word of a lying teenager over the verifiable academic record of his eldest daughter. Seeing that tie now, frayed, stained, and ruined, felt like a silent confession of everything that had decayed in their lives since they threw me out. I placed my hand on the heavy metal handle and pushed the door open. It clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing sharply in the confined space. Linda spun around instantly. Her eyes swept over my blood-stained scrubs, registering the uniform before she registered the face wearing it. She took a quick, aggressive step forward, her voice sharp, demanding, dripping with the assumption that everyone in this building was a subordinate meant to cater to her anxiety. "Where is the doctor?" She snapped her tone, echoing the same impatience she used to reserve for retail workers. "The nurse told us the attending physician would be in here 20 minutes ago. My daughter was in a horrible accident and no one is telling us anything. I want to speak to the person in charge right now." I did not say a word. I just stood under the harsh fluorescent light, letting her eyes travel up from my ruined scrubs, past the embroidered lettering on my crisp white coat, and finally up to my face. The transformation took perhaps 3 seconds. First there was annoyance, then a flicker of confusion as her brain tried to process familiar geometry in an impossible context. Then a sheer breath-stealing shock. The color drained from Linda's face so fast she looked like she had been struck by lightning. Her mouth fell open, but the words died in her throat. She reached out blindly, her hand seeking purchase, finding Charles' arm as he turned away from the sailboat painting. She grabbed him. She grabbed his forearm with such sudden, desperate force that her fingernails dug deep into the fabric of his shirt. Her knuckles turned a stark bone white from the sheer pressure of her grip. Even under the dim hospital lighting, I could see the flesh of his arm indenting beneath her clawing fingers, a grip so intense it would undoubtedly leave dark purple bruises by morning. Charles flinched, looking down at his wife, irritated by the sudden pain. "What is wrong with you?" he muttered, trying to shake her off. But Linda could only stare at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. Charles followed her gaze. He looked toward the doorway. "Tabitha," he whispered. The name sounded foreign in his mouth, raspy and weak, stripped of all the booming authority it once held. 5 years of silence hung in the air between us, heavy, suffocating, and charged with static electricity. They looked at me, taking in the confident posture, the unblinking stare, the undeniable proof of my survival stitched right into my chest. Dr. Tabitha Graham, attending physician. I did not call them Mom. I did not call them Dad. Those titles were privileges they had forfeited a long time ago, revoked the moment they chose fiction over their own flesh and blood. I crossed my arms, making sure the hospital badge was perfectly legible, and delivered my introduction with the precise, detached tone I used for every family in this hospital. "I am Dr. Graham," I said, my voice steady, carrying no warmth, no anger, just the cold weight of medical authority. "I am the attending trauma physician on duty tonight. I stabilized your daughter." Linda opened her mouth again, a soft, strangled noise escaping her lips. Charles blinked rapidly, his eyes darting frantically from the drying blood on my shirt to the coldness in my eyes, trying to reconcile the broken girl he kicked out with the formidable woman standing before him. "You?" he stammered, taking a hesitant step forward, shaking his arm free from Linda's bruising grip. "You are a doctor here. You saved her." I ignored the personal nature of the question. It did not warrant validation. I pivoted smoothly into the clinical briefing. "Paige suffered a high-speed collision," I stated, my tone brisk and professional, delivering the facts like pieces of broken glass. "She arrived in hemorrhagic shock. Her right lung had collapsed upon impact, and she was experiencing severe internal bleeding. I intubated her, placed a chest tube to re-expand the lung, and administered 4 units of rapid blood transfusion. She is currently in the operating room. The orthopedic and general surgery teams are working to repair a shattered pelvis and a severely lacerated liver. She is critical, but she is alive." They stared at me, the gravity of the medical terminology colliding with the impossible reality of the situation. The daughter they discarded had just pulled the daughter they worshipped from the wreckage. Linda finally found her voice, though it was a fragile, trembling thing, lacking all its former bite. "Tabitha," she whimpered, taking a step toward me, reaching a shaking hand out as if to touch my arm. "Please, you have to save her. You have to fix this. You know her best. She is your sister." I looked at her outstretched hand. I remembered the day she stood in the kitchen watching me pack my life into garbage bags, her arms crossed, offering nothing but silent judgment. I did not reach back. I took a deliberate step backward, resting my hand on the metal handle of the door. "I did my job as a trauma physician tonight," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, definitive cadence that echoed in the small room. I kept her breathing. "But due to hospital policy regarding conflicts of interest, I am legally stepping away from this case. I am not going to be her doctor tomorrow." I opened the door, preparing to leave them alone in the sterile room, knowing full well that my refusal to treat their golden child was about to ignite a storm they were entirely unprepared to survive. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, severing the sight of my mother reaching out and my father standing frozen in his ruined tie. I walked away, the rubber soles of my clogs squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum. I headed toward the surgical waiting area, a quiet alcove overlooking the dark harbor. The adrenaline that kept my hands steady during the code had fully evaporated. It left a cold, hollow space in my chest. I sat down on a stiff vinyl chair and stared at my palms. The rust-colored stains flaking off my skin smelled sharp. It was a metallic tang that grounded me in the present reality of the trauma center, but my mind was already slipping backward, pulled under by the sheer weight of seeing them again. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital dissolved into my memory. The metallic smell of the trauma bay vanished, replaced by the scent of expensive vanilla candles and lemon wood polish. Suddenly, I was not a 32-year-old attending physician dictating life-saving orders. I was 27 again, standing in the sunlit kitchen of our Annapolis home. The memory anchored itself on the flawless expanse of my mother's favorite granite countertops. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had driven down from Baltimore for what I assumed was a standard family dinner. I was exhausted from a grueling 70-hour clinical rotation in the pediatric ward. I desperately needed a warm meal and a soft place to land. Instead, I walked into an execution. Paige sat at the kitchen island wearing a pristine designer cashmere sweater. A sleek leather portfolio rested in front of her. She was 20 years old, vibrant, and armed with a weaponized sense of entitlement. She wanted $75,000. She called it seed capital for a lifestyle influencer startup. She laid out mock-ups of a website, a list of potential brand partnerships, and a marketing strategy based entirely on taking photos of herself on expensive vacations. She had zero actual business experience. Charles and Linda hesitated. They had just paid my fall semester tuition for medical school. That sum required them to dip heavily into their liquid savings. Paige saw their hesitation. She possessed a predatory instinct for finding the weak points in any room. She realized the only obstacle standing between her and that startup capital was my education. She removed the obstacle with terrifying precision. Paige looked at my parents. Her eyes grew wide, brimming with manufactured tears. She delivered the lie that detonated my life. "Tabitha is not using the money for school," she whispered. Her voice trembled with perfect theatrical concern. "She failed her clinical rotations months ago. She is buying pills. She is an addict." I stood there paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the fabrication. I waited for my father to laugh. I waited for my mother to demand proof. I waited for the rational adults who raised me to ask for a transcript, a drug test, a simple phone call to the university dean. None of that happened. Charles turned to me, his face hardened into a mask of disgust. He did not ask if her accusation was true. He stated it as an undisputed fact. The state flag tie he wore hung perfectly straight against his chest as he delivered his verdict. He told me I was a disgrace to our name. Linda refused to even look at me. She stared down at the granite countertop, shaking her head, mourning a tragedy she invented in her own mind. I stepped forward, my voice frantic but clear. I offered to drive to a clinic that very minute and submit blood and urine samples. I pulled up my student portal on my smartphone, shoving the glowing screen toward them to show my perfect grades. Charles slapped the device out of my hand. The glass shattered against the ceramic tile floor. The cracking sound echoed through the quiet house. "Get out," he commanded, pointing toward the front door. "We are done funding your habit. We are done with you." By Monday morning, the joint bank accounts were frozen. The tuition checks bounced. I was a third-year medical student with a shattered phone, $0 to my name, and a lease I could no longer afford. The financial math of survival became my entire world. The university financial aid office informed me my only option was private loans. I signed promissory notes with predatory interest rates nearing 14% just to keep my seat in the program. I worked 80-hour clinical weeks. Then I picked up overnight shifts organizing files in the basement of the medical library just to afford cheap groceries. I lived on peanut butter and stolen cafeteria saltines. I sold my reliable sedan and walked 2 miles in the freezing sleet to the hospital every morning. Every time my bones ached from the cold wind coming off the harbor, I thought of Paige. I pictured her sitting in a luxury apartment, playing corporate executive with the money that was supposed to secure my future. The years ground on, marked by silent, empty milestones. I survived the brutal hazing of residency through pure, spiteful determination. When I graduated at the top of my surgical class, the 2 reserved seats in the front row of the auditorium remained painfully empty. I held my diploma and smiled for the cameras hiding the hollow ache in my ribs. 2 years later, I married Nathan. He was a brilliant biotech researcher who saw me at my darkest moments. He found me crying in a hospital stairwell during my intern year, handed me a cup of black coffee, and stayed by my side ever since. He helped me rebuild my foundation from the rubble. On our wedding day, I wore a simple white dress and walked down the aisle entirely alone. My father did not give me away. My mother did not help me pin my veil. I learned the hard way that family is never defined by shared DNA. Family is defined by who actually shows up when the floor falls out from under you. A sharp, demanding beep from the pager clipped to my waistband pulled me out of the Annapolis kitchen. It threw me back into the stark reality of the Baltimore hospital. The glowing green text on the small screen indicated the surgical team was finishing up. Paige had survived the operating table. Her shattered pelvis was pinned back together. Her liver was cauterized. Now came the brutal, grueling process of intensive care. I stood up, smoothing the crisp fabric of my white coat. The memories of my starvation and my isolation faded, replaced by a resolve hardening into diamond. I had kept my sister breathing tonight, fulfilling my sacred oath as a physician. But my moral obligation ended there. I was not going to let my parents turn my workplace into their personal stage. They wanted a doctor to save their daughter. They were going to get one. It just was not going to be me. I walked toward the administrative desk at the center of the floor. I picked up the heavy black receiver of the landline phone. I punched in the internal extension for Dr. Avery. She was the most notoriously rigid, uncompromising attending physician in the entire medical network. She possessed zero bedside manner and a legendary intolerance for demanding families. It was time to make my recusal official. This transfer of care would force my parents to face an authority figure who did not care about their golden child, sparking a bitter confrontation they could never win. The phone receiver at the administrative desk felt remarkably heavy in my hand. I dialed the internal extension for the surgical intensive care unit, watching the digital clock on the wall flip to 2:14 in the morning. On the third ring, a crisp, sharp voice answered. It was Dr. Miriam Avery. She was a woman who commanded respect, not through volume, but through a terrifying, icy precision. She had been at this institution for 20 years, building a reputation as the most brilliant and least forgiving attending physician on staff. She did not tolerate excuses from medical residents, she did not coddle patients, and she famously despised families who tried to dictate clinical care. She was exactly what my current situation required. I explained the admission. I detailed the blunt force trauma, the collapsed right lung, the shattered pelvis, and the hepatic lacerations. Then I stated my reason for calling her specifically. "The patient is my sister," I said. The phone line went silent for a fraction of a second. Dr. Avery knew my history, or at least the professional version of it. She knew I worked every major holiday and never requested family leave. She knew my emergency contact file listed only my husband. I stabilized her in the trauma bay because I was the only attending available when the ambulance arrived. I continued, my voice steady. But I need to recuse myself immediately to avoid an ethical violation. I need you to take primary control of her recovery. I will be down in 5 minutes. Avery replied and hung up the phone. I pulled the official transfer of care forms from the filing cabinet behind the desk. The paperwork was standard, a routine part of hospital logistics, but the black ink felt different tonight. I filled in Paige's demographic information, listing her injuries and the life-saving interventions the trauma team had performed under my direction. When Dr. Avery arrived, she moved with her signature brisk stride, her white coat buttoned perfectly over a tailored charcoal gray suit. She did not offer a sympathetic smile or a soft touch on the shoulder. She simply held out her hand for the physical chart. I reviewed the surgical notes in the elevator, Avery stated, scanning the pages with laser focus. The orthopedic team pinned the pelvic fractures. She will be immobile for several weeks. The liver bleeding is controlled for now. You did good work in the bay, Graham. Now step away. I picked up my ballpoint pen. I clicked the top of it. The sharp, mechanical sound snapped through the quiet nurse's station. I pressed the metal tip to the signature line, signing my name with deliberate force, officially transferring authority. That single click severed my medical responsibility. I was no longer Paige's doctor. I was just a bystander wearing a stethoscope. Avery tucked the heavy chart under her arm. "Let's go inform the family," she commanded. I followed her down the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead in a low, irritating hum. When we entered the consultation room, Charles and Linda were sitting on the very edge of the gray sofas. The air in the small space was thick with a cloying mix of fear and lingering entitlement. Linda jumped up immediately, her eyes bypassing Dr. Avery entirely and locking onto my face. "Well," she demanded, her voice tight and high-pitched, "when can we see her? Is she awake? I want to talk to her, right now!" I stood, with my hands clasped securely behind my back, maintaining the physical distance of a strict professional boundary. "Paige is out of surgery," I said, keeping my tone entirely neutral, devoid of any daughterly warmth. "She is currently unconscious, heavily sedated, and transitioning to the intensive care unit. From this point forward, Dr. Avery will be taking over her case." Charles stood up, his brow furrowing deep into his forehead. "What do you mean, taking over? You are a doctor in this hospital. You are going to treat your sister." I looked at my father. I felt the old, ingrained instinct to shrink under his booming baritone, the instinct that had ruled my childhood and dictated my worth. I pushed it down, burying it under 10 years of grueling medical training and hard-won independence. It is a direct violation of American Medical Association ethical guidelines to provide primary or intensive care to a first-degree relative, I explained smoothly. I performed the emergency stabilization because it was a life or death scenario with no alternative physician present in the bay. Now that she is stable, I must step away. It is an unavoidable conflict of interest. Dr. Avery is the chief critical care attending. Your daughter is in excellent hands. Linda stepped forward, her face twisting into an ugly, familiar sneer. Her fear was rapidly morphing into something far more recognizable to me. It was raw indignation. "You are abandoning her," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "After everything that has happened, your sister is lying in a hospital bed, broken in pieces, and you are playing politics with some rule book?" "It is not politics, ma'am, doctor," Avery interjected, her voice slicing through the room like a surgical scalpel. "It is the law. Dr. Graham cannot write prescriptions, order diagnostic tests, or dictate care for a family member. It clouds clinical judgment and invites lethal mistakes. I am the attending physician now. My word is final." Charles ignored Avery entirely. He stepped closer to me, trying to use his physical height for intimidation. I saw the fraying threads of his state flag tie vibrate with his ragged, angry breathing. "This is just revenge, is it not?" he growled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for me. "You are still holding a grudge about a misunderstanding from 5 years ago. So you are going to walk away when Paige needs you the most. You are going to let strangers experiment on her just to punish us for the past." The sheer audacity of the accusation hung in the stale air. A misunderstanding. That was his chosen term for throwing me onto the street, destroying my credit score, and attempting to ruin my medical career before it even started. They truly believed I owed them my expertise simply because we shared a bloodline. They viewed my medical license not as something I earned through blood, sweat, and starvation, but as a family asset they were entitled to leverage whenever they saw fit. My success was only valuable to them if they could extract something from it. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match his rising temper. I simply met his gaze with eyes as cold as the Chesapeake Bay in January. "My decision is final, Charles. I am officially off the case. Dr. Avery will update you on the visitation protocols once the patient is settled." I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. I could hear Linda beginning to raise her voice behind me, demanding that Avery call the hospital administrator, insisting they had a fundamental right to choose their preferred physician. Avery shut the heavy wooden door, trapping their toxic demands inside the small room, cutting off the sound of my mother's shrill complaints. I walked straight back to the central computer at the nurse's station and pulled up Paige's electronic medical record. My fingers flew across the keyboard, striking the keys with rhythmic precision. I was not just writing a standard transfer note. I was building a legal fortress. I documented every single detail of the interaction in the official chart. Family exhibits hostile behavior regarding ethical transfer of care. Father demanded protocol violations and attempted intimidation. Mother accused medical staff of abandonment. I hit the save button, locking the notes permanently into the hospital's secure server. Any administrator who reviewed this file would see a clear pattern of family disruption from minute one. I knew my parents better than anyone else in this building. They operated on the deeply flawed assumption that rules applied to everyone else, while they deserved special exceptions. By doing the right ethical thing, I had inadvertently ignited their relentless wrath. They were about to realize that their usual tactics of bullying and manipulation held zero currency in my domain. I watched the wall clock tick toward 3 a.m, bracing myself for the inevitable moment when my mother would try to flex her non-existent authority on the intensive care floor. The real war for control was just beginning, and they were walking onto a battlefield I commanded. Dawn broke over the Baltimore skyline, slicing through the thick fog rolling off the Chesapeake Bay. The pale slate gray light of early morning began to filter through the tall windows of the medical center. Inside the hospital, the atmospheric shift was palpable. The heavy, exhaustive fatigue of the night shift slowly gave way to the brisk, determined energy of the day staff arriving for their rounds. I stood near the central charting station on the surgical intensive care floor, holding a lukewarm cup of black coffee in my left hand. My fingers tapped rhythmically against the edge of the keyboard as I finished my final electronic notes. My shift officially ended at 7 in the morning, but trauma attendings rarely left the building on time. Down the main corridor, near the visitor elevators that connected directly to the underground parking structure, a sharp noise shattered the morning quiet. It was a familiar, piercing tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stepped away from the glowing monitor, peering down the long, waxed hallway. Linda stood in front of the automated parking payment kiosk. She was jabbing her manicured index finger against the glowing touchscreen, her posture rigid with indignation. Next to her, Charles was awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "This machine is broken," my mother snapped at a passing orderly, waving a thin piece of plastic in the air. "It keeps saying declined. I have a premium tier account. Find someone to run it manually, right now." The orderly, caught off guard by her sudden hostility, murmured a polite apology and pointed toward the main cashier desk located on the ground floor. Charles quickly reached into his leather wallet, producing a different card. His face flushed a deep, uncomfortable shade of crimson. He swiped the second card fast, physically shielding the screen from anyone walking by. The machine beeped, a hollow, rejecting tone. He tried a third time, his shoulders tensing before finally pulling out a crumpled $20 bill to feed into the cash slot. A seed of curiosity took root in my mind. Growing up, my parents flaunted their pristine credit scores and robust investment portfolios like badges of honor. A declined transaction was an unfathomable event in their polished suburban reality. Watching my father frantically stuff cash into a machine while my mother glared at the ceiling revealed a microscopic crack in their flawless facade. But I did not have the luxury of time to dissect their financial missteps. They retrieved their exit ticket and began marching straight toward the surgical intensive care unit, their faces set in twin masks of determination. The surgical ICU is a highly controlled environment designed specifically for maximum visibility and rapid clinical response. The central desk acts as a command center, surrounded by glass-walled rooms where critical patients are monitored around the clock. I stepped back into the shadows of the charting alcove and watched as Linda bypassed the waiting area entirely. She strutted directly up to the charge nurse, a seasoned veteran named Marcus. She slapped her palms down on the counter, leaning over the high desk. "My daughter is Paige," she announced. Her tone implied that the name alone should grant her immediate security clearance and royal deference. "She was brought up here an hour ago. I want her moved." Marcus blinked, maintaining his steady, professional composure. "Ma'am, the patient is currently in Bay 4. She is resting under heavy sedation. Moving her is not an option at this stage of her recovery." "You do not understand," Linda insisted, her voice rising an octave. "Bay 4 is a glass fishbowl. Everyone walking by can look right in at her. I know this hospital has private corner suites with harbor views on the 7th floor, the VIP rooms. I want her transferred up there immediately." "Those suites are step-down units reserved for stable recovering patients," Marcus explained patiently. "Your daughter requires constant direct line-of-sight monitoring from this central desk. She stays right here." Linda straightened her spine, preparing to play her ultimate trump card. "Do you know who I am? My other daughter is Dr. Tabitha Graham. She is a senior attending physician in this very building. She saved that girl downstairs. I expect you to make the necessary arrangements, or I will have her speak to your nursing supervisor." I remained frozen near the charting station, listening to her weaponize my name. For 5 years, my title meant nothing to her. It was an ongoing joke, a fabricated cover story for a fictional drug habit she helped peddle to the rest of our extended family. Now, the moment it carried cultural capital and leverage, she wore my achievement like a stolen designer coat. The sheer hypocrisy of it burned the back of my throat like battery acid. I took a deep breath, preparing to step forward and shut down the spectacle myself. Before I could move a single muscle, Dr. Avery materialized from the adjacent hallway. She walked with the purposeful gliding stride of a shark sensing blood in the water. Her metal clipboard was tucked neatly under her arm, her white coat immaculately pressed. "Is there a problem at my desk?" Avery asked. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried an undeniable cutting edge that silenced the entire station. Linda turned, sizing up the older woman with a dismissive glance. "I am demanding a room transfer for Paige. As Dr. Graham's mother, I expect her sister to receive the proper accommodations." "You expect nothing." Avery interrupted her tone, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "I am the chief attending of this unit. Dr. Graham has zero authority on this floor. She legally recused herself hours ago. Your daughter will remain in Bay 4 because her shattered pelvis and compromised lungs require strict, uninterrupted observation. You are not checking into a luxury hotel. You are standing in a trauma center." Linda bristled, her cheeks turning a mottled red. "Excuse me, you cannot speak to us this way. My daughter just survived a horrific crash. She is in agonizing pain." Avery opened the heavy metal chart in her hands, scanning the fresh post-operative notes. Regarding her pain management, the surgical team ordered a standard continuous morphine drip in the operating room. I have reviewed her preliminary file and instructed the pharmacy to restrict all non-essential narcotics. We will manage her discomfort with non-opioid analgesics moving forward. Charles stepped forward, his fraying state flag tie swinging against his chest. "Why would you do that? She just had major surgery." "Because Avery said snapping the chart shut with a sharp thud, standard protocol requires extreme caution until the official toxicology reports return from the laboratory. I do not prescribe heavy narcotics blindly. If you have an issue with my clinical protocols, you are welcome to sign your daughter out against medical advice and secure a private ambulance to transport her to another facility. Otherwise, you will sit down in the waiting room, remain quiet, and let my nurses do their jobs." Avery did not wait for a response. She pivoted and walked straight into a patient room, leaving my parents adrift in the center of the unit. Linda was visibly shaking with suppressed rage. She spun around, scanning the floor until she locked eyes with me standing in the alcove. She marched over, her heels clicking against the linoleum. "Are you going to let her treat us like this?" Linda demanded. Her voice was a harsh, venomous whisper meant to coerce rather than comfort. "You are an attending. You have influence here. Fix this, right now. Get her a private room. Override that ridiculous medication order. She is your sister." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. I studied the deep lines of stress etched around her mouth, the frantic, expectant gleam shining in her eyes. She genuinely believed that our shared DNA was a magic wand capable of erasing half a decade of profound betrayal in an instant. "Family takes care of family, Tabitha," she hissed. She leaned in close, smelling of stale perfume and raw desperation. I held my ground, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy, practiced detachment of a seasoned physician delivering a terminal diagnosis. Family shows up for graduations, I replied. You are currently speaking to hospital staff. Linda recoiled as if she had been slapped across the face. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The delusion that she held any power over me shattered right there on the sterile ICU floor. Before she could recover her footing, Charles placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, a strange mix of defeat and cold calculation crossing his features. He gestured toward the quiet corridor leading to the emergency stairwell, away from the prying ears of the nursing staff. Tabitha, he said. His voice was unusually low, adopting a smooth tone he used to reserve for difficult business negotiations. Step into the hall. We need to have a serious conversation about the billing. The heavy fire door swung shut behind us, cutting off the rhythmic beeping of the intensive care monitors and the hushed voices of the nursing staff. We stood isolated in the concrete emergency stairwell. The air here was 10 degrees cooler than the main floor, smelling faintly of industrial bleach, old dust, and damp concrete. The fluorescent lighting above us flickered on a faulty ballast, casting a sickly pale yellow hue over the gray walls. I leaned my lower back against the cold metal railing, crossing my arms securely over my chest, waiting for the man who shared my DNA to state his business. Charles paced a tight, agitated circle on the small landing. I watched him with the same detached clinical scrutiny I applied to a complex diagnostic chart. 5 years ago, my father was a man who projected undeniable invulnerability. He obsessed over bespoke tailoring, social perception, and maintaining absolute control over his household. He was the kind of man who commanded a room simply by standing in the center of it, expecting everyone else to orbit around his demands. Now the frame holding up his expensive suit seemed hollow. The charcoal fabric draped loosely over his shoulders, suggesting he had lost a significant amount of weight since the last time I saw him. As he crossed his arms in front of his chest, the sleeves of his jacket rode up toward his wrists. He quickly, almost reflexively, tugged them back down, but my trained eyes caught the brief exposure. The cuffs of his pale blue dress shirt were worn thin. The cotton threads were unspooling, fraying at the very edges, carrying the distinct look of a garment that had been washed and worn far past its intended lifespan. It was a microscopic detail, a tiny imperfection he would have never tolerated during my childhood. To a physician trained to spot the hidden symptoms of a systemic failure, it was a glaring red flag. My parents were bleeding money, and they were trying desperately to hide the hemorrhage behind their usual bravado. Charles stopped pacing. He turned to face me. He cleared his throat, forcing his rigid facial muscles into a soft, awkward smile. It was an expression so foreign on his features it looked physically painful, like a mask that did not quite fit the contours of his skull. "Tabitha," he began, his voice dropping into a low, smooth cadence. It was a faux fatherly tone, a manufactured warmth he had not directed at me since I was a teenager bringing home flawless report cards. He took a hesitant step closer, bridging the physical gap between us. "You have done incredibly well for yourself. I saw the way those nurses looked at you out there. You command genuine respect in this hospital. Your mother and I, well, we are proud of the physician you have become." The words hung in the chilly, sterile air. They tasted like ash in my mouth. I remembered this exact voice telling me I was a disgrace to our family name. I remembered this exact voice commanding me to leave my house keys on the kitchen island and walk out the front door with nothing but a duffel bag. I did not soften. I did not nod in gratitude for his overdue praise. I maintained a glacial, unblinking stare, waiting for the inevitable pivot I knew was coming. He sighed, heavily rubbing the back of his neck, playing the role of the weary, overburdened patriarch. "This accident is a profound tragedy," he continued, looking down at his scuffed leather shoes. Paige has been working so hard on her new business ventures. The entrepreneurial life is incredibly stressful. The startup costs, the networking events, the pressure to succeed. It takes a heavy toll on a young woman. She has been stretched very thin lately, trying to make her dreams a reality. I remained perfectly silent. I knew exactly what kind of networking Paige did. It involved luxury yachts, expensive bottle service, designer handbags, and zero actual revenue. The thing is, Charles said, his eyes darting toward the small glass window of the fire door and then back to my face, Paige let her premium health insurance policy lapse a few months ago. She missed the open enrollment window because she was traveling for a marketing campaign. She is currently completely uninsured. The admission landed between us with a heavy, sickening thud. A patient without medical coverage in a level 1 trauma center was facing a financial catastrophe of ruinous proportions. The ambulance transport alone was thousands of dollars. The trauma bay stabilization, the emergency orthopedic surgery to pin her shattered pelvis, the hepatic cauterization, the multiple units of O-negative blood, and the indefinite stay in the intensive care unit would easily surpass 6 figures by the end of the week. Add in the months of specialized physical therapy and the customized wheelchair she would require, and the final bill would be staggering. "We are in a bit of a tight spot with our liquidity right now," Charles explained, his tone casual, attempting to minimize the sheer magnitude of his financial confession. "Our assets are tied up in various long-term investments. We cannot liquidate them immediately without taking a profound penalty, and the billing department down on the first floor will want a significant deposit for an uninsured patient of this high acuity." He looked directly at the embroidered title on my white coat, his eyes tracing the blue thread that spelled out my achievement. "You're a senior attending here," he noted, his voice gaining a sliver of expectant confidence. "You draw a very healthy doctor salary. You know the billing administrators. We need you to step up. We need you to cover the initial hospital deposits and the out-of-pocket maximums until we can reorganize our portfolio. It is the right thing to do, Tabitha. Family steps up when things get hard." I did not interrupt him. I let his audacious demand echo off the concrete walls. I simply stared at his fraying cuffs, my mind automatically pulling up the mental spreadsheet I had meticulously maintained for half a decade. I thought about the private medical school loans I was forced to sign the week they cut me off. I remembered the exact principal amount required to keep my seat in the surgical program. I remembered the staggering 14% interest rate that capitalized every single month, compounding my debt while I studied anatomy. While they were funding Paige's fictional business ventures and paying the rent for her luxury apartment overlooking the water in Annapolis, I was selling my blood plasma on Tuesday mornings just to afford the gas required to drive to my clinical rotations. I remembered the freezing winter nights I slept in the back seat of my sedan, wrapped in a cheap sleeping bag with the engine off because I could not make rent. I remembered eating leftover saltines stolen from the hospital cafeteria, my hands shaking from caloric deficit while I studied for my board exams. They did not care if I starved. They did not care if my dreams died in the back of a freezing car. Now they stood in my hospital, expecting me to empty my hard-earned bank accounts to finance the survival of the sister who orchestrated my ruin. I weaponized my silence. I let the quiet in the stairwell stretch far beyond the boundaries of normal human conversation. 10 seconds passed, then 20. The silence became a heavy, oppressive force pressing down on his shoulders. Charles shifted his weight awkwardly. The leather soles of his shoes scraped against the concrete floor, a harsh sound in the quiet space. The manufactured warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a flickering, undeniable panic. He was waiting for me to open my checkbook. He was waiting for the obedient, desperate daughter to crave his patriarchal approval enough to purchase it. In that prolonged, heavy silence, the last remaining illusion of my childhood evaporated into the sterile hospital air. I saw my father with brutal, unvarnished clarity. They did not come to the trauma center to reconcile with their estranged daughter. They felt no remorse for the 5 years of isolation they inflicted upon me. They came to the hospital, saw my white coat, and found a convenient financial solution to their golden child's catastrophic mess. They did not view me as a human being. They did not view me as a daughter who survived their cruelty. I was nothing more than an automated teller machine expected to dispense cash and absolution on demand. I uncrossed my arms and stood up straight, aligning my posture to project every ounce of authority I possessed. "You seem to have fundamentally misunderstood our current dynamic," I said, my voice steady, carrying the resonant calm of a woman who owed him nothing. 5 years ago, you explicitly informed me that my financial burdens were no longer your concern. Today, I am informing you that your financial negligence is not my emergency. I will not pay a single cent toward her care." Charles' face hardened into a mask of pure indignation. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar. The faux fatherly facade shattered, revealing the familiar tyrant underneath. He opened his mouth, drawing in a sharp breath to unleash the same booming, vitriolic rage he used to exile me from his home. Before a single syllable could escape his lips, the heavy fire door swung violently outward, striking the metal doorstop with a loud, ringing crack. Dr. Avery stepped onto the concrete landing, her steel gray eyes locking onto my father. She held a thick, sealed manila envelope in her right hand. "The results are back from the laboratory," Avery announced, her tone clipping through the tension like a surgical shears through fabric. "And the police liaison is waiting at the central desk. It is time we discuss exactly what caused your daughter's accident." Dr. Avery stood on the concrete landing, her steel gray eyes locking onto my father. She held a thick, sealed manila envelope in her right hand. "The results are back from the laboratory," she announced, her tone clipped through the tension like surgical shears through fabric. "And the police liaison is waiting at the central desk. It is time we discuss exactly what caused your daughter's accident." Charles froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade under the flickering fluorescent light. He took a hesitant step backward, his leather shoes scraping against the concrete floor. Linda pushed past him, her designer trench coat swishing around her knees. She snatched the envelope directly from Avery's hands before the chief attending could even offer it. "What does it say?" Linda demanded, tearing the paper seal. She expects good news. She expects a medical anomaly, a sudden aneurysm, a random act of fate that would absolve her precious golden child of any personal responsibility. Avery did not blink. She folded her hands in front of her crisp white coat. "I am sharing this information with you in your capacity as the designated next of kin," Avery stated, her voice devoid of any comforting warmth. "Dr. Graham is present solely as a family member. The police have completed their preliminary investigation of the crash site. Furthermore, the mandatory hospital toxicology screen has processed." Linda pulled the stapled packet of papers free. Her eyes darted across the top page, scanning the dense medical jargon. She frowned, unable to decipher the clinical codes. Charles leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the black ink. I did not need to read the entire document. My trained eyes caught the single most important detail printed in bold at the top right corner. Timestamp: 2:14 a.m. That was the exact moment the automated machines finalized the blood analysis. That was the moment undeniable truth replaced 5 years of carefully constructed fiction. "Allow me to translate," Avery offered, stepping forward and tapping the center of the first page. Your daughter was operating her vehicle with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.19. That is more than double the legal limit in this state. Furthermore, the immunoassay panel returned positive for high levels of cocaine and synthetic amphetamines. She was highly intoxicated on a cocktail of expensive recreational narcotics. The stairwell fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to amplify, filling the empty space between us. The police liaison provided the crash metrics. Avery continued, relentless in her delivery of the facts. There were no skid marks on the pavement. She did not attempt to brake. She was traveling 90 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. She veered across 2 empty lanes and drove her luxury SUV directly into a concrete barrier. No other vehicles were involved. She is entirely at fault. The police will be issuing multiple felony citations once she is conscious. I watched my parents process this information. A normal mother and father would exhibit horror. They would express profound grief that their child was battling severe substance abuse. They would fall to their knees in gratitude that she had not killed an innocent family in a minivan during her reckless joyride. But Charles and Linda were not normal parents. They were architects of delusion. Charles straightened his posture, puffing out his chest, instantly shifting into defense mode. "This is a mistake," he declared, pointing a trembling finger at the lab report. "Those machines must be calibrated wrong. Paige is an entrepreneur. She runs a demanding startup. She attends high-level networking events. Sometimes clients order drinks and she has to participate to secure funding. She is just under an immense amount of professional pressure." I stared at him, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of his denial. He was standing in a hospital stairwell, holding undeniable proof that his youngest daughter was driving under the influence of hard drugs, and he was calling it a networking strategy? "There is no mistake regarding the cocaine," Avery countered, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. The laboratory cross verified the sample twice. Your daughter has a severe substance problem. You need to prepare yourselves for the legal and financial ramifications of her choices. Avery turned on her heel, her duty fulfilled, and pushed through the heavy fire door, leaving the 3 of us isolated once again. The moment the door clicked shut, Linda crumpled the toxicology report in her fist. Her chest heaved. Her eyes darted around the cold concrete walls, searching for a target to absorb her rising panic. She could not attack the chief attending. She could not attack the police. She certainly could not hold Paige accountable. Her gaze finally locked onto me. "This is your fault," Linda hissed. The accusation hung in the chilling air. I did not flinch. I did not move. I just watched her construct a new alternate reality in real time. Charles nodded eagerly, latching on to the narrative pivot. "Your mother is right," he added, his voice gaining a sickening surge of confidence. "Paige always looked up to you. You were the older sister. You were supposed to guide her. Instead, you vanished. You cut us out of your life. You left her to navigate the stress of building a business entirely on her own." The sheer audacity of their mental gymnastics took my breath away. 5 years ago, Paige looked them in the eye and falsely accused me of using my medical school tuition to buy drugs. They believed her. They threw me onto the street. They starved me out. And now, holding the actual, verifiable proof that Paige was the one buying narcotics, they were blaming me for not being around to supervise her. "You left us," Linda continued, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You abandoned this family to chase your precious medical degree. You thought you were better than us. If you had been a supportive sister, If you had been home to listen to her struggles, she never would have turned to these substances. She was self-medicating because she missed you, because you broke her heart. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my brain. The last lingering, microscopic sliver of hope I harbored, the tiny, foolish child inside me that still wished my parents could be rational human beings, withered and died on that stairwell landing. They were incurable. Their pathology was terminal. They would literally rewrite the laws of physics before they admitted they backed the wrong child. You are holding a piece of paper that proves your favorite daughter is a reckless hazard to society, I said, my voice echoing off the concrete, carrying a hollow metallic resonance. She drove a vehicle into a wall at 90 miles per hour while under the influence of cocaine. And you are standing here, telling yourselves it happened because I went to medical school. Charles took a menacing step forward, his jaw clenched tight. Do not speak to your mother with that condescending tone. We are dealing with a crisis. We need solidarity, not your endless judgment. You are going to help us fix this legal mess. You know judges. You know important people in this city. You are going to make those police citations disappear. I let out a short, dry laugh. The sound startled them. It was devoid of humor, a harsh expulsion of air born from pure disbelief. You want me to commit obstruction of justice? I asked, tilting my head, studying him like a fascinating toxic specimen under a microscope. You want me to leverage my professional reputation to shield a drunk driver from the consequences of her own actions. She is your blood, Linda screamed, tears of frustration finally spilling over her eyelashes. She is lying in a bed out there, broken into pieces. Have you lost every shred of your humanity? Before I could deliver the final, crushing reality check they desperately needed, the heavy fire door swung open for a third time. Elias, my lead trauma nurse from the emergency bay, stood in the threshold. He looked past my parents, his eyes finding mine. He carried an electronic tablet tucked under his arm, his expression tight with urgency. Dr. Graham, Elias said, his voice tense. I am off the clock, Elias, I reminded him. Dr. Avery is handling the floor. I know, he replied, stepping aside to hold the door open, but Dr. Avery asked me to find you. The sedation is wearing off faster than anticipated. Your sister is waking up, and she is asking for you by name. I looked at Charles and Linda. Their faces transformed instantly, swapping their manufactured outrage for desperate fawning concern. They pushed past me, rushing out of the stairwell to greet their waking golden child. I followed slowly behind them, feeling the cold concrete beneath my shoes, knowing full well that whatever fiction Paige was about to spin next would require an audience. I walked onto the intensive care floor, preparing to stand at the foot of her bed and watch the architect of my ruin open her eyes. The intensive care unit, Bay 4, was an orchestrated symphony of clinical technology. Monitors glowed with rhythmic vital signs, while intravenous pumps delivered precisely measured fluids into compromised veins. I followed Charles and Linda through the heavy sliding glass doors, stepping into the sterile enclosure. Elias stood near the head of the bed, expertly adjusting the settings on the mechanical ventilator. The heavy sedation was finally lifting. The chemical fog retreating from my sister's brain allowed her central nervous system to resume command over her battered physical form. She looked incredibly fragile, dwarfed by the massive hospital mattress and the labyrinth of plastic tubing tethering her to life. Severe bruising painted her swollen face in vivid shades of violet, deep plum, and sickly yellow. Her ruined designer clothes were gone, replaced by a generic thin cotton gown. Yet, as I stood at the foot of her bed, my gaze caught a glaring, absurd incongruity. Her hands rested on top of the thin thermal blanket. Despite the catastrophic impact that shattered her pelvis and severely lacerated her liver, her fingernails remained completely untouched. They were long, manicured acrylic extensions painted a flawless matte beige. Those pristine nails gripped the metal side rails of the bed with a white-knuckled intensity, anchoring her waking consciousness to the physical world. Elias moved with practiced efficiency, performing the delicate process of extubation. He suctioned the airway, removing accumulated fluids, then deflated the securing cuff. With a smooth, practiced motion, he withdrew the plastic breathing tube from her trachea. Paige gagged instantly, coughing weakly as her vocal cords adjusted to the sudden rush of unfiltered oxygen. Linda immediately lunged forward, hovering over the mattress, cooing soft, frantic reassurances into her favorite child's ear. Charles stood right behind his wife, his posture stiff, projecting a fiercely protective aura over a daughter who had just driven an expensive vehicle into a concrete wall at lethal speeds. Paige blinked against the harsh fluorescent lighting overhead. Her chest heaved, pulling in shallow, painful breaths. Her eyes, initially glassy and unfocused, darted frantically around the unfamiliar clinical room. They found our mother first. A brief flash of recognition washed over her battered features. Then her gaze drifted past Linda's shoulder, traveling down the length of the bed until it collided directly with me. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting deep inside the pockets of my pristine white coat. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not utter a word of sisterly reassurance. I simply allowed her to absorb the visual evidence of my existence. I watched the cognitive gears turn behind her dilated pupils. 5 years ago, Paige constructed a brilliant, devastating narrative. She convinced our parents I was a miserable failure, a hopeless addict squandering my medical tuition on illicit substances. It was a lie, crafted to secure her own financial inheritance, a strategic character assassination that left me homeless, isolated, and drowning in predatory debt. She expected me to vanish into obscurity, destroyed by the sheer weight of parental rejection. She built her entire identity on my supposed downfall. Instead, she was waking up broken, helpless, and staring at the ultimate manifestation of her own failure. Her eyes tracked the crisp fabric of my uniform. They lingered on the heavy stethoscope draped around my neck. Finally, they locked onto the dark blue thread embroidered across my chest. Dr. Tabitha Graham, attending physician. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The profound humiliation of her current state, combined with the undeniable proof of my towering success, triggered a catastrophic emotional short circuit. The lingering confusion in her gaze evaporated, replaced instantly by pure, unadulterated venom. The golden child was cornered, stripped of her glamorous influencer facade and exposed to the one person who knew exactly how deep her toxicity ran. Her manicured fingers tightened violently around the metal bed rails. She opened her mouth, her voice a raw, rasping croak ruined by the abrasive friction of the breathing tube. "Get her away from me," Paige wheezed, her chest hitching with sudden manufactured panic. Linda gasped, reaching out to stroke Paige's matted hair. "It is okay, sweetheart. You are safe in the hospital. You had a terrible accident." Paige thrashed her legs, crying out in genuine agony as the movement aggravated her pinned pelvic fractures. She ignored the pain, weaponizing her physical distress. "I do not want her here," she shrieked, her vocal cords straining to produce a louder, more desperate sound. "She is not a real doctor. She is an imposter. She forged those credentials. She is an addict, Mom. She wants to hurt me. She is going to kill me. Get her out of my room right now." The sheer audacity of her performance was breathtaking. Even while strapped to a trauma bed, bleeding internally and heavily intoxicated on illicit narcotics, her first instinct was to resurrect the lie that ruined my 20s. She sought to manipulate the room, demanding our parents choose her fictional victimhood over my verifiable reality. She needed to be the center of their universe, even if it meant accusing a decorated physician of attempted murder. And predictably, the architects of my exile delivered their expected response. Linda spun around, positioning her body between me and the mattress like a human shield. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, maternal fury. "You heard her," my mother snarled, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "She is terrified of you. You are traumatizing her. Step back right now." Charles advanced, stepping into my personal space, utilizing his physical height to project dominance. The frayed edges of his cuffs peeked out from his suit jacket, contrasting sharply with his aggressive posture. "You are aggravating her condition," he barked, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Leave this bay immediately. I will not allow you to stand there and gloat over your sister's pain. We want a different attending. We want someone who actually cares about her well-being." They were frantic, entirely willing to indulge the hysterical demands of a drug-impaired driver rather than acknowledge the accomplished professional standing before them. They demanded absolute obedience. They expected me to shrink, to apologize, to scurry away in shame, just like I did when they threw me out of their Annapolis kitchen. I refused to play my assigned role in their dysfunctional theater. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my credentials or argue against her absurd allegations. Arguing with a manipulator only grants legitimacy to their delusion. I maintained a glacial, unyielding composure. I slowly removed my right hand from my coat pocket and reached for the communication pager clipped to my waistband. "Patient exhibits severe agitation and paranoid delusions post-extubation," I stated calmly, addressing Elias, who was standing quietly near the ventilator, watching the spectacle unfold. "Document this outburst in her electronic chart immediately. Note the extreme hostility and the potential risk to her surgical sites due to uncooperative thrashing." Elias nodded, his fingers tapping swiftly across the surface of his mobile diagnostic tablet, cementing her erratic behavior into the permanent legal record. Charles reached out, attempting to snatch the pager from my grasp. "Stop talking about her like she is a laboratory specimen," he demanded. I stepped back with fluid precision, avoiding his clumsy grasp entirely. I pressed the red emergency button on the side of my device, connecting directly to the hospital security dispatch center. "This is Dr. Graham in Surgical Intensive Care Bay 4. I spoke clearly into the microphone. "I need 2 security officers dispatched to this location immediately. We have a hostile patient exhibiting aggressive behavior accompanied by disruptive family members who are interfering with clinical protocols and risking vital medical equipment." Linda gasped, clutching her chest in performative outrage. "You are calling the guards on your own family!" "You are not my family," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, absolute 0 frequency. "You are unauthorized personnel, creating a hazardous environment in a critical care unit." Paige continued to sob loudly, squeezing her eyes shut, playing the role of the terrified victim to absolute perfection. She wailed that I was tampering with her intravenous lines, that I was trying to inject her with poison, spinning a web of accusations so outlandish they bordered on the absurd. But I knew the game she was playing. She needed to discredit my authority before the toxicology reports became the central focus of the conversation. She needed to make me the villain, to distract from her own monumental failures. I turned my back on the mattress, ignoring the chaotic symphony of her manufactured tears and my parents' righteous indignation. I walked toward the sliding glass doors, positioning myself strategically near the exit to await the arrival of the security detail. I watched my father frantically try to soothe the daughter who had just bankrupted his retirement, while my mother glared at me with an intensity that could melt steel. They believed they were winning. They believed their collective volume could drown out my silent, meticulously documented truths. But their tantrum was nothing more than the final, desperate thrashing of a dying narrative. The heavy doors of the intensive care unit buzzed, signaling the arrival of the security team. At that exact moment, my personal cell phone vibrated deep inside my coat pocket, alerting me that Nathan had finally arrived on the premises. My chosen family was walking into the building, bringing with him a digital reckoning that would permanently dismantle their golden delusion. The heavy mechanical doors of the surgical intensive care unit slid shut behind me, sealing the chaotic theater of my sister's awakening inside. The sterile hallway stretched out, bathed in the sharp artificial light of early morning. I leaned against the cold wall, closing my eyes for a single restorative second. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving a dull throb behind my temples. My parents were currently huddled around Paige, constructing a new fortress of delusion, convinced that their volume and righteous indignation would somehow rewrite the reality of her toxicology report. I needed a moment to center myself before the security detail arrived to enforce the boundaries I had just set. Footsteps approached, steady and purposeful, completely devoid of the frantic energy that characterized everyone else in this hospital. I opened my eyes. Nathan stood at the end of the corridor. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit for the biotech firm. He had clearly thrown on a gray cashmere sweater and dark jeans the second he received my text. He held a sleek brushed steel thermos in his left hand and a small canvas tote bag over his right shoulder. Even in the harsh, unforgiving light of the trauma wing, he radiated an undeniable grounding calm. Nathan was a man who operated entirely on logic, data, and profound, unwavering loyalty. When I met him during my grueling surgical residency, I was a feral, isolated creature surviving on spite and caffeine. He did not try to fix me. He simply stood beside me, an immovable object against the relentless tide of my trauma, offering a steady hand while I rebuilt my life from the rubble. He walked up to me, his dark eyes scanning my blood-stained scrubs, instantly assessing the physical and emotional toll of the night. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew the answer to that question was infinitely complex. Instead, he simply handed me the thermos. Double shot espresso, a splash of oat milk, precisely 140 degrees, Nathan said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. And a fresh pair of compression socks in the bag. Your shifts always run long when the bay gets chaotic. I took the thermos, the heat transferring through the metal, thawing the ice that had settled deep in my bones. Thank you, I whispered, unscrewing the lid. The rich, dark scent of the coffee was the first comforting thing I had experienced in hours. Nathan gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my forehead.
The police liaison in the lobby mentioned a high-speed collision involving an intoxicated driver. I assume that is why your parents are currently staging a loud, very public protest inside the visitor waiting area.
I took a slow sip of the scalding espresso. Paige woke up. She immediately accused me of attempting to murder her to distract from the fact that she drove her SUV into a wall while high on cocaine. Charles and Linda instantly sided with her, demanding a new attending physician and demanding I use my influence to make her felony citations disappear. I called security to have them removed from the intensive care unit. Nathan's jaw tightened, a subtle shift that indicated a dangerous, protective anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior. He despised my parents. He despised the cruelty they inflicted upon me, and he despised the effortless way they continued to enable Paige's destructive behavior. They are desperate. I continued leaning my head back against the wall. Charles cornered me in the stairwell earlier. He admitted they are completely broke. They do not have the liquidity to cover her trauma bills. He essentially ordered me to empty my savings accounts to finance her recovery. They drained their entire retirement portfolio funding her lifestyle influencer startup. Nathan frowned, the analytical gears of his researcher brain instantly engaging. That does not make sense. I looked at him confused. What does not make sense? They are completely indulgent. They threw money at her every demand. Nathan shook his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. Tabitha, I deal with venture capital and startup valuations every single day. A lifestyle influencer brand does not require a $400,000 initial capital investment. She wasn't building a physical manufacturing plant or securing patents. The overhead for that specific type of digital venture is negligible. Even accounting for a luxury apartment in Annapolis and designer clothes burning through nearly $500,000 of liquid retirement assets in 5 years requires a catastrophic level of financial mismanagement. There is a massive discrepancy in that ledger. I frowned, the logic of his statement piercing through the emotional haze of the night. You think she was spending the money on the narcotics? Perhaps, Nathan replied, adjusting the strap of his canvas tote. But cocaine and synthetic amphetamines, while expensive, rarely bankrupt a robust portfolio that quickly, unless the user is supplying an entire city. There is a missing variable in this equation. I want to find it. He gestured toward the small, quiet physician's lounge located just off the main corridor. Go change your scrubs. Put on the fresh socks. I'm going to set up my laptop in the lounge. Public financial records, property deeds, and corporate registry filings are completely accessible if you know exactly where to look. I want to see exactly what kind of businesses your sister has been running for the past half-decade. I nodded, grateful for his analytical intervention. I walked toward the locker room, the heat of the coffee radiating through my chest, while Nathan headed toward the lounge, his mind already dissecting the financial mystery my parents had unwittingly presented. 10 minutes later, I emerged, wearing clean blue scrubs, the heavy blood-soaked fabric deposited into the biohazard bin. The fresh compression socks instantly relieved the dull ache in my calves. I felt marginally more human, ready to face the impending administrative nightmare my parents were undoubtedly creating in the lobby. I pushed open the door to the physician's lounge. Nathan was sitting at a small circular table, his laptop open, his fingers flying across the keyboard with astonishing speed. The screen was a chaotic mosaic of digital documents, spreadsheets, and scanned public records. The ambient light from the monitor cast a pale glow across his features, highlighting the deep concentration, etching lines across his forehead. He did not look up when I entered. "Tabitha," he said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth, replaced by a cold, clinical precision. "Shut the door. Lock it." I frowned, pushing the heavy wooden door shut and twisting the deadbolt. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. "What did you find?" I asked, stepping closer to the table. Nathan stopped typing. He turned the laptop screen toward me. He had accessed the Maryland State Corporate Registry, cross-referencing Page's name with various limited liability companies. He had also accessed public court records, searching for civil judgments or liens. "Your father was not lying when he said they are broke," Nathan explained, tapping a digital document on the screen. "He took out a second mortgage on the Annapolis house 3 years ago. The equity is entirely gone. But the money did not go to a lifestyle startup." He opened a new window displaying a scanned PDF document. It was a promissory note, a legal contract detailing a massive, unsecured private loan. "Look at the date," Nathan commanded. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. The date was exactly 5 years ago. It was the same month my parents threw me out of their house. It was the exact week I was desperately negotiating with the University Financial Aid Office to secure funding to finish my medical degree. "Now look at the principal amount," Nathan said, his voice dropping an octave. $45,000. My breath caught in my throat. That was the exact cost of a single year of tuition at my medical school. It was the exact amount my parents had refused to pay, citing Paige's fabricated story about my drug addiction. Nathan clicked the mouse, scrolling down to the signature page at the very bottom of the document. "This is a private, high-interest medical education loan," he explained, his tone razor-sharp. "The lender is a predatory financial institution known for issuing high-risk capital without requiring extensive background checks or collateral." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The signature line was filled with a swirling, elegant cursive. It was my name, Tabitha Graham, but I never signed that document. I secured my loans through a completely different institution utilizing federal channels and a local credit union. "Look at the co-signers," Nathan stated, pointing to the secondary signature lines. "Charles and Linda." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force. The digital breadcrumbs formed a clear, devastating picture. Paige did not just lie about my medical school failure to eliminate me as competition for their savings. She orchestrated a massive, calculated financial fraud. She forged my signature. I whispered the words, tasting like poison on my tongue. "She took out a private tuition loan in my name, and she convinced your parents to co-sign it," Nathan finished, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "She likely told them you were desperate, that you needed the money for an expensive out-of-state rehabilitation facility to treat the severe narcotics habit she invented. She played on their vanity and their fear of public scandal. They co-signed the loan to quietly bury your fictitious addiction, believing they were funding your recovery." I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning white. The sheer, breathtaking malice of her plan was staggering. She stole $45,000 in my name, funneling the money directly into her own accounts to fund her luxurious lifestyle. "And they have been paying it back," Nathan added, pulling up a digital ledger showing monthly installments. "For 5 years, Charles and Linda have been making aggressive payments on this fraudulent loan, draining their retirement accounts to cover the predatory interest rates, completely convinced they were paying off the massive rehab debt of their disgraced, addicted eldest daughter. They did not just believe her lie, they financed it. They bankrupt themselves, paying off a debt I never incurred, while the daughter they worshipped used the stolen capital to buy the very narcotics that just put her in a trauma bay." A sudden, sharp pounding on the locked door of the lounge shattered the heavy silence. "Tabitha," my father's voice boomed through the thick wood, vibrating with unrestrained rage. "I know you are in there. Open this door immediately. We are going to resolve this financial situation right now, or I swear to God, I will ruin your career before the sun comes up." I looked at Nathan. The protective fury in his eyes mirrored the sudden icy resolve solidifying in my own chest. The golden child's ultimate lie was exposed, sitting right here on a glowing digital screen. Charles was demanding I surrender my hard-earned capital to save his family. He was about to discover that the only thing I was going to hand him was the bill for his own profound stupidity. I reached forward and twisted the deadbolt. The heavy brass mechanism clicked a sharp and definitive sound that echoed through the quiet tension of the physician's lounge. I pulled the wooden door inward. Charles stood in the sterile hospital hallway, his face a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. Linda hovered right behind his right shoulder, her hands gripping the strap of her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white. The polished, affluent veneer they had spent decades cultivating in their pristine Annapolis neighborhood was entirely gone. They looked frantic, cornered, and highly dangerous. Charles stepped forward, attempting to cross the threshold into the lounge. He tried to use his physical size to force me backward, a classic intimidation tactic he had utilized throughout my entire childhood. I planted my rubber clogs firmly on the linoleum floor. I did not yield a single inch. I stood my ground, forcing him to halt just outside the door frame. Behind me, Nathan remained seated at the circular table. His fingers rested silently on the keyboard of his laptop, the glowing screen still displaying the undeniable proof of Paige's financial fraud. Nathan did not intervene. He simply watched, a silent, immovable sentry, recording every single syllable of the impending interaction.
You are going to listen to me right now.
My father snarled. His voice was a low, vibrating hum of raw desperation. He kept his volume suppressed, acutely aware of the nurse's station located just 50 feet down the corridor. I folded my arms across the chest of my clean blue scrubs. "I am listening," I replied. My tone was devoid of any emotional inflection, mirroring the detached cadence I used when delivering poor prognoses to grieving families. Charles outlined his new reality. He explained that Dr. Avery had just delivered a brutal update regarding Paige's long-term recovery. Due to the severity of the shattered pelvis and the underlying substance dependency revealed by the toxicology report, a standard discharge to a home environment was physically impossible. She required intensive, round-the-clock medical supervision, combined with strict addiction treatment. Charles already had a specific destination in mind. He described a dual-diagnosis inpatient rehabilitation facility nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a luxury recovery center, the kind of place that offered equine therapy, private chefs, and spa treatments alongside daily group counseling. "The initial intake fee is $80,000, Charles stated. He delivered the number as if it were a minor administrative fee, a simple transfer of funds I should authorize without a second thought. "We need that money wired by noon today to secure her bed. Once she is transferred, we can begin sorting out the rest of the surgical bills." I stared at the fraying cotton threads on his shirt cuffs. I studied the deep, exhausted lines etched around his eyes. He was standing in a hospital he did not pay for, demanding a ransom for a sister who stole my identity, expecting me to finance a luxury vacation for a convicted drunk driver. "I am not giving you a single dollar," I said quietly. Linda gasped, stepping out from behind his shadow. "Tabitha," she pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her own delusion. "You have the resources. We see the car you drive. We see the title on your coat. She is going to end up in a state-run facility if we do not secure this private room. You cannot let your sister suffer in a place like that." She drove a vehicle into a concrete wall at 90 miles per hour while high on cocaine, I reminded them, refusing to let them sanitize the narrative. A state-run facility is exactly what she earned. My bank accounts are not a safety net for her felony charges. That definitive refusal triggered the final, inevitable escalation. Charles leaned closer. I could smell the stale coffee and bitter panic on his breath. He dropped the commanding patriarch act and embraced outright extortion. "You are going to pay that intake fee," Charles hissed, his eyes narrowing into dark, menacing slits. "Because if you refuse, I will march directly down to the hospital administration office. I will file a formal, documented grievance with the Maryland State Medical Board." I kept my posture rigid. "On what grounds?" I asked. "I will tell them you deliberately provided negligent care in the trauma bay," he threatened, his voice dripping with venom. "I will testify that you compromised her airway. I will claim you delayed inserting the chest tube because you harbored a deep-seated vindictive jealousy against your younger sister. I will tell the licensing board that you allowed her to suffer on that table out of pure spite." The sheer depravity of his threat hung in the sterile air, chilling the blood in my veins. He was willing to destroy the very foundation of my survival to protect the child who had already bankrupted him. He viewed my medical degree merely as a hostage. It was a bargaining chip to be traded for Paige's luxury rehab stint. He promised to launch a malpractice investigation that would freeze my clinical credentials, drain my savings with exorbitant legal fees, and permanently revoke the license I had starved myself to earn. A hollow ache bloomed deep in my chest, a fleeting ghost, like grief for the father I never truly had. But that sorrow was instantly eradicated by a surge of cold, diamond-hard clarity. He thought I was still the terrified 22-year-old girl standing in his kitchen begging for tuition money. He failed to realize that the brutal environment he forced me into had forged me into someone entirely immune to his threats. I did not defend my clinical decisions. I did not beg him to spare my hard-earned career. I did not even raise my voice. I simply lifted my right hand. I extended my index finger and pointed at the drywall located just outside the lounge door frame. Bolted to the wall, positioned right at eye level, was a stark, laminated poster. It was the same poster I walked past every single morning when I arrived for my shift. I reached out and tapped the thick plastic surface twice with my fingernail. The sharp, clicking sound drew his frantic gaze. The bold red letters at the top of the sign spelled out the hospital network zero tolerance policy. "Read it," I commanded. Charles blinked his eyes, tracing the crisp black text printed beneath the red header. It explicitly defined the verbal abuse, physical intimidation, or financial extortion of healthcare personnel as a strictly prohibited and highly prosecutable offense. At the very bottom of the poster, printed in a smaller, dense font, were the specific Maryland state penal codes related to the harassment of medical staff. I looked back into his panicked eyes. Threatening a licensed physician with fabricated malpractice claims in exchange for financial compensation is not a simple family dispute, I informed him, my voice carrying the steady, resonant authority of a judge delivering a sentence. It is a felony. It is textbook extortion. Linda opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off instantly. Every single hallway in this intensive care unit is equipped with high-definition audio and visual recording systems. I continued gesturing toward the small black dome camera mounted to the ceiling tiles just above our heads. My trauma bay interventions were witnessed by 4 nurses, 2 surgical residents, and an anesthesiologist. My clinical decisions are flawless and thoroughly documented. If you walk down to the administration office and attempt to leverage a false medical board complaint to extort $80,000 from an attending physician, you will not leave this building in a taxi. You will leave in the back of a police cruiser. I watched the cold, unforgiving reality of his legal jeopardy settle into the rigid lines of his face. The illusion of his power dissolved. He could not bully me. He could not fire me. He could not evict me. His threats were hollow, carrying no weight in a domain built on verifiable facts and strict legal protocols. He was a bankrupt man standing in a hallway, armed with nothing but empty malice. Charles realized his intimidation tactics had completely failed against me. His desperation mutated, searching for a softer target. He looked past my shoulder, peering into the quiet lounge. His gaze bypassed me entirely and landed on the silent, observing presence of my husband. If he could not break my resolve, he intended to break the man standing behind me. He took a deep breath, shifting his weight, preparing to unleash his toxic fury on the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle him. Charles stood frozen outside the doorframe of the physician's lounge, his eyes tracking my outstretched finger toward the zero tolerance policy poster on the wall. The blood drained from his face as the absolute reality of his situation crystallized. His grand threat of medical board investigations and career destruction had evaporated before it even materialized. dismantled by a piece of laminated paper and the cold, unyielding fact that he possessed absolutely no leverage in this building. His shoulders slumped for a fraction of a second, the posture of a man realizing he was playing a high-stakes game with an empty hand. Then his gaze shifted past my shoulder. He looked directly at Nathan, who remained seated at the circular table, his fingers still resting lightly on the laptop keyboard. Charles recognized my husband. He had met Nathan exactly once, during a brief, incredibly strained encounter at a local coffee shop shortly after our engagement. Charles had spent that entire meeting treating Nathan, a man with 2 advanced degrees and a sterling reputation in the biotech industry, like a naive, easily manipulated subordinate. Now, staring at the financial ruins of his own life, Charles sought a target he believed he could still bully into submission. He took a slow, menacing step away from the poster, attempting to redirect his toxic energy. He pushed past the invisible boundary I had set, stepping into the small lounge. Linda remained hovering in the hallway, wringing the strap of her handbag, sensing the impending disaster but entirely powerless to stop it. I stepped sideways, positioning myself between Charles and the table. But Nathan raised his left hand, a simple, fluid gesture indicating I should stand down. Nathan did not stand up. He did not close his laptop. He simply swiveled his chair slightly to face my father directly, his dark eyes radiating an intense, unnerving calm. Charles interpreted Nathan's seated posture as a sign of weakness. He leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the surface, invading Nathan's personal space with aggressive, patriarchal arrogance. "Listen to me, boy," Charles growled, his voice a low, vibrating engine of misplaced authority. "I do not know what kind of radical, independent nonsense you have been filling her head with for the last few years, but this is a family matter. My daughter is lying in a hospital bed, broken into pieces, and your wife is standing there, refusing to help us cover the cost of her care. I expect you to handle your household. I expect you to talk some sense into her and make her open that checkbook before this situation gets completely out of hand." The absolute audacity of the statement hung heavily in the sterile air of the lounge. Charles genuinely believed he was invoking a primal masculine solidarity. He thought he could bypass my autonomy entirely by appealing to an archaic notion of spousal control. He expected Nathan to nod, to step in and manage his difficult, stubborn wife, forcing me to surrender my capital to save his golden child. The dramatic irony of the moment was so thick it was almost suffocating. Charles was attempting to intimidate the exact man who had just spent the last 20 minutes meticulously unraveling the fraudulent financial empire Paige had built. Charles was demanding Nathan force me to pay for Paige's recovery, completely unaware that Nathan possessed the digital proof that Paige had stolen $45,000 in my name, a crime Charles himself had unwittingly co-signed. Nathan did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He met my father's aggressive glare with a look of profound, clinical disgust. "First of all, Nathan," began his voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of Charles' manufactured authority with quiet, devastating precision. "Do not ever refer to me as boy again. My name is Nathan, and I assure you, I am entirely capable of handling my household." Charles bristled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Then do your job and control your wife. She is acting like a petulant, vindictive child while her sister is suffering." Nathan closed his laptop with a soft, definitive snap. He interlaced his fingers and rested his elbows on the table. "My wife is not acting like a child, Charles. She is acting like a highly successful, independent trauma physician who survived the profound abuse and neglect you subjected her to. I have spent the last 5 years watching her rebuild her life from the ground up. I watched her work 80-hour weeks on zero sleep, I watched her secure her medical degree despite the predatory loans she was forced to take out because you cut her off. I know exactly the kind of strength she possesses, and I know exactly the kind of cowardice it takes to abandon your eldest child based on a lie. Charles opened his mouth to interrupt, the veins in his neck bulging, but Nathan simply spoke over him, his voice rising just enough to command absolute silence in the room. You are demanding she empty her savings to cover the cost of a luxury rehabilitation facility for a daughter who drove her vehicle into a wall while highly intoxicated on illicit narcotics. Nathan continued his words, landing like heavy, precise blows. You are demanding financial salvation from the very woman you threw onto the street. The sheer hypocrisy of your presence in this hospital is staggering.
You do not know the whole story.
Charles sputtered, his hands trembling slightly against the tabletop. Paige has been under immense pressure. I know the entire story, Charles Nathan stated, his eyes locking onto my father's with an intensity that made the older man visibly recoil. I know that you drained your retirement accounts funding her lifestyle influencer startup. I know you took out a second mortgage on your house in Annapolis. And I know with absolute certainty that Paige forged Tabitha's signature to secure a $45,000 private medical loan 5 years ago. A loan that you and Linda co-signed and have been paying off ever since. The color vanished entirely from Charles' face. His jaw dropped. The aggressive, bullying patriarch disappeared, replaced instantly by a man watching the foundation of his reality crumble into dust. He looked from Nathan to me and then back to the closed laptop on the table, his mind desperately trying to process the magnitude of the revelation.
What are you talking about?
Charles whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of all its former volume. That was Tabitha's rehab debt. Paige told us Tabitha needed the money for an out-of-state facility.
Paige lied to you.
I interjected, stepping forward, letting the cold truth echo off the walls. Just like she lied about my medical school failure. She forged my signature, stole the capital, and used it to fund her own luxurious lifestyle. And you were so eager to believe the worst about me, so desperate to protect your golden child, that you financed her fraud without asking a single question. Charles stumbled backward, his hands falling away from the table. He looked as though he had been physically struck. Linda, hovering in the doorway, let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth, as the devastating reality of Paige's deception finally pierced through her protective delusion. You are bankrupt. Charles Nathan continued, delivering the final surgical strike with unwavering calm. You enabled her destruction, and she drained every resource you possessed. And now you expect Tabitha to clean up the mess? That is not going to happen. You have zero power here. You have zero leverage. And if you attempt to threaten my wife again, if you ever try to leverage her medical license to extort money, I will personally hand the evidence of Paige's forgery and your complicity directly to the district attorney. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the ventilation system seemed deafening. Charles stood paralyzed, his chest heaving as he struggled to comprehend the full scale of his ruin. The daughter he worshipped had betrayed him, stealing his wealth and replacing it with insurmountable debt. The daughter he discarded possessed the undeniable proof of the crime, and her husband was holding the digital execution order. Nathan stood up slowly, picking up his laptop and the canvas tote bag. He walked around the table, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. My wife has patients to attend to, Nathan said, his voice returning to its normal, steady cadence. Her shift is not over. You are going to leave this lounge. You are going to walk back to the intensive care waiting area. You will sit down, you will remain quiet, and you will wait for the billing department to process the charges for an uninsured trauma patient. If you cause any further disruption, the hospital legal counsel, whom I have already contacted, will have you escorted off the premises by the police." Charles did not argue. He did not threaten. The fight was entirely drained from his body. He looked at me one last time, his eyes searching for a shred of the daughter who used to crave his approval, finding only a formidable physician who owed him nothing. He turned, slowly, his shoulders slumped, and walked out of the lounge, Linda trailing silently behind him, like a ghost. Nathan watched them retreat down the hallway until they disappeared around the corner. He turned to me, offering a small, reassuring nod. "Finish your shift," he said quietly. "I will wait for you in the lobby. We are going home soon." I watched Nathan disappear around the corner, his calm stride a stark contrast to the frantic energy humming through the rest of the trauma center. With my husband waiting securely in the main lobby, I turned my attention back to the clinical demands of my morning. My shift was technically ending, but the handover process required meticulous attention to detail. I retreated to the charting alcove, pulling up the electronic records for the patients remaining in the surgical intensive care unit. I needed to finalize the transfer documentation for Dr. Avery. I typed out the remaining surgical updates, ensuring every metric was logged with flawless precision. Just as I hit the final save command, the plastic pager clipped to my waistband vibrated against my hip. I glanced down at the small monochrome screen. The digital extension displayed was not from the emergency bay or the surgical suites. It was a direct page from the ground floor executive wing. Specifically, it was the Office of Risk Management and Hospital Legal Counsel. I unclipped the device, my thumb tracing the smooth plastic edge. Charles had not retreated to the waiting area to accept his defeat. His ego, battered and bruised by the revelations in the physician's lounge, had driven him to seek a higher authority. He was attempting to execute his final, desperate threat. He was trying to bypass my clinical authority by appealing directly to the corporate administrators, hoping to paint himself as the grieving father victimized by a vindictive employee. He was walking blindly into a snare I had set hours ago. I smoothed the front of my clean blue scrubs, adjusted the stethoscope around my neck, and walked toward the staff elevators. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The descent was smooth and silent. The doors slid open to reveal a wing of the hospital that felt like an entirely different universe. The harsh fluorescent lights and linoleum floors of the clinical wards were replaced by soft, recessed lighting, plush acoustic carpeting, and heavy mahogany doors. The air here smelled of expensive lemon polish and roasted coffee, a stark departure from the metallic tang of blood and bleach upstairs. I navigated the quiet corridor until I reached the frosted glass doors of the risk management suite. The receptionist offered a polite nod and gestured toward the main conference room at the end of the hall. The glass walls of the meeting space were partially obscured by privacy blinds, but the gaps revealed the undeniable theater unfolding inside. Charles was standing at the head of a large, polished wooden table. He was leaning forward, gesturing with broad, sweeping arm movements, putting on a masterclass in performative outrage. Linda sat nearby, dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue, playing the role of the devastated mother. Seated across from them, maintaining a posture of perfect, unbothered stillness, was Mr. Caldwell. He was the chief legal counsel for the hospital network, a man known for his razor-sharp intellect and an utter lack of patience for frivolous complaints. I grasped the stainless steel handle and pushed the door open. The heavy hinges glided silently, but the shift in air pressure drew everyone's attention. Charles stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open as he stared at me. He had expected to conduct this character assassination behind closed doors. He did not anticipate the target of his smear campaign being invited to the execution.
"Ah, Dr. Graham."
Mr. Caldwell said, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone. "Thank you for joining us. Please take a seat." I walked to the table and took the leather chair situated directly next to the hospital attorney. I did not look at my parents. I kept my gaze fixed on Mr. Caldwell, maintaining the professional decorum expected in an executive suite. Charles recovered his footing, puffing out his chest to project a false sense of dominance. "As I was just explaining to your legal department," Charles announced, directing his venom toward me, but pitching his voice for the attorney, "I am preparing to file a formal grievance with the state medical board. My daughter was brought into this facility fighting for her life, and this physician allowed personal family disputes to delay critical care. She abandoned her post. She refused to provide the VIP accommodations my daughter requires, and she treated us with profound disrespect. I expect a formal apology, and I expect the hospital to waive the exorbitant fees we are being charged due to her deliberate negligence." It was a staggering display of manipulation. He was attempting to weaponize the language of medical malpractice to secure a financial payout, hoping the hospital would simply erase Paige's medical debt to avoid a public scandal. He believed his tailored suit and deep voice would intimidate a corporate lawyer, just as easily as they intimidated a teenage girl in a suburban kitchen. Mr. Caldwell did not flinch. He did not offer a sympathetic nod. He simply reached out and picked up a thick, standard-issue hospital clipboard resting on the table in front of him. He lifted the heavy plastic board a few inches into the air. Then he let it drop. The clipboard hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp, heavy thud. The loud crack echoed through the conference room, instantly shattering the rhythm of Charles' self-righteous monologue. The sudden noise forced my father to blink, his posture faltering under the sudden commanding shift in the room's energy. Mr. Graham, the attorney, began his tone stripped of all corporate pleasantries. "In the medical and legal professions, we rely on a concept known as contemporaneous documentation. It means that notes taken at the exact time of an event hold undeniable legal supremacy over narratives constructed hours later." Caldwell flipped open the metal clasp of the clipboard, revealing a stack of printed electronic medical records. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the top sheet with clinical detachment. "Let us review the actual timeline of tonight's events," Caldwell stated. "At 11:42 p.m., your daughter arrived in hemorrhagic shock. Dr. Graham was the senior attending in the trauma bay. She performed a textbook intubation and successfully placed a chest tube, interventions that unequivocally saved your daughter's life. We have corroborating statements from 4 attending nurses and the surgical team confirming her actions were swift, precise, and entirely devoid of hesitation." Charles shifted his weight, his face flushing a dull red. "That is not the point. The point is what happened after." The attorney raised a single index finger, silencing my father with a gesture of pure authority. "I am not finished." Caldwell flipped to the next page. At 2:14 a.m., Dr. Graham contacted the chief critical care attending, Dr. Avery, to initiate a formal transfer of care. She did this to strictly adhere to the American Medical Association ethical guidelines regarding the treatment of first-degree relatives. She did not abandon her post. She executed a mandatory legal recusal to protect this hospital from liability. Linda sniffled, clutching her designer handbag tighter. She was cruel to us. She refused to give Paige a private room. "This is a level 1 trauma center," Ma'am Caldwell replied, his eyes locking onto my mother with a chilling lack of sympathy. "It is not a boutique hotel. Room assignments are dictated by medical triage, not parental preference. Furthermore, the record indicates a very different narrative regarding the cruelty displayed this morning." Caldwell turned to the final page on the clipboard. This was the trap I had set. These were the notes I had meticulously typed into the secure server while my parents were busy throwing their initial tantrum outside the intensive care unit. At 2:30 a.m., Caldwell read aloud, his voice projecting across the mahogany table. Dr. Graham documented that family members exhibited hostile behavior regarding the ethical transfer of care. The father demanded protocol violations and attempted physical intimidation. The mother accused medical staff of abandonment. Charles gripped the back of his leather chair, his knuckles turning pale. You cannot use her own biased notes to defend her. She wrote those to protect herself. I do not need to rely solely on Dr. Graham's notes, Caldwell countered seamlessly. Because Dr. Avery, a physician with zero personal connection to your family, entered her own addendum to the chart at 6:15 a.m. Dr. Avery documented that you were disruptive, combative, and attempted to dictate clinical pain management protocols despite being informed of the patient's positive toxicology screen for illicit narcotics. The mention of the toxicology report drained the remaining fight from Charles' chest. He realized the legal counsel had access to every single piece of data, including the undeniable proof of Paige's intoxicated driving. And finally, Caldwell said, closing the clipboard with a definitive snap, "We received a brief visit from Dr. Graham's husband just before you demanded this meeting. He informed security that you attempted to extort $80,000 from an attending physician in the doctor's lounge, threatening a fabricated medical board complaint if your financial demands were not met." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The trap had sprung flawlessly. Charles had marched into the executive suite expecting to play the victim. Instead, he was sitting across from a ruthless corporate attorney holding a bulletproof dossier of his hostile, potentially criminal behavior. You came into my office attempting to secure a financial settlement through intimidation, Caldwell stated, folding his hands, resting them on top of the closed clipboard. You are not a victim, Mr. Graham. You are a profound liability to this institution. Charles opened his mouth, his jaw working silently as he searched for a rebuttal that did not exist. He looked at me, a silent plea for intervention flickering in his exhausted eyes. I stared back, my expression entirely blank, offering him the exact same mercy he offered me 5 years ago. "This meeting is over," Caldwell announced, standing up from his leather chair to signal the conclusion of the discussion. "The clinical teams will continue to provide standard necessary care to your daughter. However, your presence in this facility is now subject to strict conditions. If you raise your voice at any member of my clinical staff, if you demand VIP treatment, or if you ever approach Dr. Graham with another financial threat, I will issue a formal trespass warning." Linda let out a quiet sob, finally grasping the inescapable reality of their situation. "You will be escorted from the building by armed security," Caldwell continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "I will personally file a restraining order on behalf of the hospital network. Do you understand these terms?" Charles swallowed hard. The arrogant patriarch was gone, replaced by a broken man drowning in a sea of his own making. He gave a single stiff nod. "Excellent," Caldwell said, gesturing toward the frosted glass doors. "You may proceed to the main lobby. The billing department has prepared the preliminary expense reports for an uninsured trauma patient. They are waiting for you near the front entrance." Charles turned away from the table. He did not look at me again. He shuffled toward the door, his posture ruined, looking a decade older than he had just a few hours prior. Linda followed him out into the corridor, her designer heels clicking softly against the floorboards, a quiet retreat of total defeat. I remained seated until the heavy door swung shut. The tension drained from my shoulders. I stood up, offering a professional nod to the legal counsel. My shift was finally over. The medical crises and the administrative battles were concluded. There was only one task left to complete before I walked out of those sliding glass doors and returned to the quiet, peaceful life I had built. I needed to visit the billing department, retrieve a very specific piece of paper, and deliver the final, unvarnished truth my parents had been avoiding for half a decade. I left the executive suite and navigated the quiet mahogany corridor. The heavy air of corporate consequence lingered in my wake. My clinical obligations were formally concluded. I rode the staff elevator up to the surgical locker room. The space was completely empty. I stripped off the clean blue scrubs and tossed them into the laundry receptacle. I dressed in my own clothes, selecting a tailored black blazer, dark denim trousers, and leather boots. I reached for my white coat hanging on the metal locker hook. My fingers brushed the laminated identification badge pinned to the lapel. I unfastened the metal clasp. The sharp pin released with a quiet, definitive snap. I slipped the plastic card into my pocket. That simple, physical action severed my final tether to professional obligation. I was no longer an attending physician bound by the strict codes of bedside manner and clinical diplomacy. I was entirely off the clock. Before descending to the main atrium, I took a deliberate detour. I walked toward the Patient Financial Services Department. The administrative assistant recognized me immediately and offered a polite greeting. I requested the preliminary expense summary for the uninsured trauma patient currently occupying intensive care Bay 4. The assistant processed the request rapidly, printing the comprehensive ledger. I placed the thick stack of warm paper into a plain manila portfolio. I grasped it firmly in my right hand. I traversed the expansive corridors until the architecture opened into the towering glass-walled lobby of the medical center. Morning sunlight flooded the space, casting long geometric shadows across the polished terrazzo floor. The chaotic energy of the trauma bay felt light years away, replaced by the hushed, ambient murmur of visitors purchasing coffee and navigating the reception desks. I scanned the vast room. Nathan stood near the sliding exit doors, a silent and immovable sentinel. His posture was relaxed, yet his dark eyes tracked my every movement. He was a physical anchor, waiting patiently to guide me back to the peaceful life we built together. On the opposite side of the atrium, occupying a cluster of vinyl waiting chairs, sat Charles and Linda. The brutal reality of their encounter with the hospital legal counsel had clearly taken a physical toll. Charles sat hunched forward, his forearms resting heavily on his knees, staring blankly at the floorboards. The frayed cuffs of his shirt were now glaringly obvious, a pathetic symbol of his ruined financial empire. Linda sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her designer trench coat looked rumpled and entirely out of place amidst the clinical surroundings. I began my approach. My leather boots clicked a steady metronomic rhythm against the hard floor. The sound cut through the ambient noise. Linda lifted her head. Her gaze locked onto my approaching figure. Her eyes dropped instantly to the crisp folder clutched in my grasp. A profound, almost grotesque transformation occurred across her features. The devastating reality of their impending bankruptcy, the shock of the felony charges, and the humiliation of the legal trap all vanished in a singular heartbeat. The delusion they fed on for decades resurrected itself. Linda sat up straight. She nudged my father sharply in the ribs, motioning her head toward me. Charles looked up. He observed me walking toward them. He saw the document. I watched the tension drain from his shoulders. He exhaled a long, heavy breath, leaning back against the vinyl chair. Linda actually smiled. It was a small, smug, triumphant curving of her lips. It was the expression of a woman who believed she had successfully weathered a temporary storm of rebellion. They genuinely assumed I had caved to the pressure. They thought my detour to the financial services department was a surrender. In their warped reality, my defiance in the lounge and my maneuvering in the executive suite were merely the dramatic tantrums of an ungrateful child throwing a fit before inevitably falling back into line. They believed the manila portfolio contained a receipt. They thought I had paid the exorbitant hospital deposit. They assumed I had secured the $80,000 luxury rehabilitation bed for their golden child. Their arrogance was a staggering pathological condition. They were completely insulated from logic, relying entirely on the deeply ingrained assumption that I was programmed to seek their approval at any personal cost. I stopped 5 feet away from their chairs. I did not offer a greeting. I simply scrutinized them. For the first time in 32 years, I did not see my parents. I did not see the formidable figures who dictated my childhood, who established the impossible standards I nearly killed myself trying to meet. I saw two aging, exhausted strangers trapped in a prison of their own design. Growing up, they treated affection like a finite, heavily guarded resource. It was a zero-sum game where my sister's triumph required my subjugation. They fostered an environment where love was exclusively earned through utility, and my utility was always measured against a fabricated perfection. I spent my entire youth making myself smaller, quieter, and more accomplished, desperately hoping to earn a fraction of the devotion they showered upon her. Standing in that sunlit lobby, unburdened by the heavy white coat and the expectations of a daughter they abandoned, the invisible chains dissolved completely. I realized they never possessed the capacity to love me. They only possessed the capacity to exploit me. When I stopped being a convenient resource, I ceased to exist in their hearts. Linda stood up, brushing imaginary lint from her coat. Her smug smile widened into an expression of magnanimous forgiveness. "I knew you would come to your senses," she said. Her voice carried a sickening, patronizing warmth. "We understand you were upset earlier. Emotions run high during a crisis. But at the end of the day, you know your duty. Your sister needs that specialized facility. I assume everything is settled with the billing coordinator?" Charles stood up beside her, attempting to reclaim a shred of his lost patriarchal dignity. He adjusted his ruined tie. "We can move past the unpleasantness of this morning," he added, his tone dripping with unearned grace. "Once the transport to the Mountain Recovery Center is complete, we can sit down and discuss a repayment plan. We are willing to overlook your insubordination today, considering you stepped up to handle the immediate financial burden." The breathtaking audacity of their dialogue felt surreal. They were offering me conditional forgiveness for the crime of surviving their abuse. They expected me to express gratitude for the privilege of emptying my bank accounts to save the sibling who stole my identity. I maintained a perfectly blank expression, letting their delusional words hang in the vast open space of the atrium. I felt no anger. The fiery indignation that fueled my actions in the trauma bay had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, absolute indifference. "You are confused," I stated. My voice was quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. The volume forced them to lean forward slightly to hear me. Linda's smile faltered, a microscopic tremor disrupting her confident facade. "What do you mean? You have the paperwork right there. You paid the deposit." I lifted the portfolio, holding it suspended between us. I did not open it. I let the physical object serve as a bridge between their fantasy and my reality. "You spent 5 years curating a narrative where I was the villain," I explained, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with my mother. "You allowed her to cast me as a hopeless addict because it provided a convenient excuse to cut me off. It allowed you to funnel your resources exclusively toward her without feeling a shred of guilt. You built a luxurious, affluent life on a foundation of absolute lies." Charles clenched his jaw, the familiar defensive anger attempting to surface, but his fear of the hospital legal counsel kept him rooted to the spot. "Do not start this again. You brought the receipt. Give it to us so we can begin the transfer process." I looked at my father, studying the desperate, frantic energy vibrating beneath his skin. He was terrified. He knew deep down in the dark corners of his consciousness that the fragile house of cards he constructed was collapsing, and he was silently begging me to prop it back up. "I brought this file because you demanded a resolution," I replied, my voice slicing through the ambient noise of the lobby like a scalpel. "You stood in the executive suite and demanded the administrators waive your exorbitant fees. You stood in the lounge and demanded I finance a luxury vacation for a convicted drunk driver. You demanded accountability. You demanded action." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, eliminating the final physical distance between us. The scent of Linda's expensive perfume mixed with the stale odor of fear emanating from Charles. I held the dossier out, positioning it directly in front of my father's chest. "I am no longer bound by the ethical constraints of this hospital." I told them, the absolute finality of my words echoing in the space between us. "I am not your doctor. I am not your savior. And I am certainly not your daughter. I am simply the person delivering the exact consequence you earned." Charles hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to take the manila envelope. Linda leaned in close, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating dread, realizing the smug assumption she made moments ago was a catastrophic miscalculation. They were about to open a document that would completely destroy their reality, forcing them to face the literal, itemized cost of their favorite child's profound deception. I held the manila portfolio steady, suspended in the sunlit air between us. Charles reached out, his fingers trembling with a fragile cocktail of relief and lingering arrogance, grasped the thick cardboard edge. He pulled the dossier from my grip. Linda leaned closer to his shoulder, her eyes bright with the desperate anticipation of a crisis averted. They fully expected to find a zeroed balance. They anticipated a confirmation receipt from the Mountain Recovery Center, a tidy financial bow tying up the ugly loose ends of their mourning. Charles flicked the metal clasp open. He reached inside the envelope and extracted the top sheet of paper. It was printed on crisp, white hospital letterhead. The stark, black ink detailed a comprehensive, itemized ledger of trauma care. I stood in silence, watching his eyes dart back and forth as he scanned the columns. He processed the line items, one by one. The emergency ambulance transport fee, the trauma bay resuscitation protocol, the rapid blood transfusions, the orthopedic surgical hardware required to pin a shattered pelvis, the hepatic cauterization, the continuous surgical intensive care monitoring, the pharmacy charges. His gaze inevitably dropped to the bottom right corner of the page. He found the total balance due for an uninsured patient. $112,000. The color drained from his cheeks in a sudden visible rush. His jaw fell slack. He stared at the six-figure sum as if the paper itself had just bitten his hand. This was not a receipt for a luxury rehabilitation deposit. This was the preliminary financial reckoning for saving his daughter's life, and it did not even include the impending costs of physical therapy or long-term outpatient care. "What is this?" Linda breathed. Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper. She clutched the lapels of her trench coat, peering over his shoulder at the staggering number. Her confident posture wilted. "That is the cost of survival," I stated, keeping my tone level, measured, and entirely detached. Paige allowed her medical coverage to lapse. This institution requires payment for services rendered. The billing department is expecting you to establish a structured payment plan before she is discharged into your care. Charles shook his head, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. "You were supposed to handle this. You said you came to deliver a resolution. You walked over here to fix this situation." "I did deliver a resolution," I replied, maintaining unyielding eye contact. "I resolved my involvement. I am providing you with the exact dimensions of the mess you nurtured. But there is more." Turn to the next page. Charles hesitated. A primal instinct seemed to warn him that the ensuing documents held even worse revelations. But the compulsion to understand his ruin forced his hand. He flipped the heavy billing ledger over, revealing a secondary packet of papers fastened with a binder clip. This was the dossier Nathan had meticulously compiled in the physician's lounge. The top document was a scanned copy of a legal promissory note. Charles recognized it instantly. It was the private, high-interest loan he and Linda had co-signed 5 years ago. It was the loan they firmly believed financed my fictitious stint in a luxury narcotics rehabilitation facility. "Look at the signature line on the borrower agreement," I instructed. Charles dragged his eyes down the page. He found my name, Tabitha Graham, written in swirling, elegant cursive. "Now look at the supporting documentation attached directly behind it," I continued. My voice carried the steady, rhythmic cadence of a prosecutor laying out an airtight case. "My husband is a meticulous researcher. He cross-referenced the digital footprint of that loan application. He pulled the Internet protocol logs, the timestamp data, and the device identification metrics used to submit the digital paperwork." Charles fumbled with the pages. His hands were shaking so severely the paper rattled in the quiet lobby. "The loan was not initiated from a health clinic," I explained. "It was not initiated from my medical school dormitory. The application was submitted from an Internet protocol address registered to your residential router in Annapolis. The digital signature was finalized on a laptop registered under Paige's name." Linda let out a sharp, suffocating gasp. She stumbled backward, bumping into the vinyl waiting chair, her legs failing to support her weight. She collapsed onto the seat, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with silent, tearless sobs. "She stole my identity," I said, pronouncing each word with sharp, undeniable clarity. "Paige forged my signature to secure $45,000 in private capital. She spun a tragic fairy tale about my academic failure and addiction to ensure you would co-sign the debt without demanding to speak to me directly. She utilized that money to fund her designer wardrobe, her luxury apartment, and the illicit substances that just caused a near-fatal collision." Charles stared at the digital logs, absorbing the undeniable proof of his favorite child's staggering deception. The reality of his situation crashed over him in crushing, suffocating waves. For half a decade, he had drained his hard-earned retirement portfolio to pay off a fraudulent debt, believing he was performing a noble paternal sacrifice. He had banished his eldest daughter to protect a criminal. The golden child myth shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the terrazzo floor. "This cannot be real," Charles whispered. A single, pathetic tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracing a path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. "She would not do this to us. We gave her everything she ever wanted. We protected her." "You gave her permission to be monstrous," I corrected him, offering no sympathy. "You enabled every single toxic impulse she possessed because it was easier than actually parenting her. You rewarded her lies because they validated your own inherent biases. You wanted a golden child who needed your constant financial intervention, and you were willing to sacrifice me to maintain that comforting illusion." I stepped closer, ensuring my final words struck with maximum precision, sealing the trap they built for themselves. 10 minutes ago, I contacted the 3 major credit bureaus. I informed them. I executed a hard freeze on my Social Security number. I also filed a formal report with the Baltimore Police Department detailing the identity theft and financial fraud. Paige is already facing multiple felony citations for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment. By tomorrow morning, she will be formally charged with wire fraud and felony identity theft. Charles dropped the manila folder. It hit the floor with a soft slap. The pristine white pages spilled across the polished stone, fanning out like a discarded deck of cards. He did not attempt to pick them up. He looked at me, a hollow, shattered shell of the imposing patriarch who once dictated my worth.
What are we supposed to do?
He pleaded. His voice was stripped of all pride, leaving only a raw, echoing despair.
We have no money. We cannot afford this hospital bill. We cannot afford the defense attorneys she will need. She requires 24-hour care for her pelvic fractures. How are we supposed to survive this nightmare?
I looked down at the spilled documents, then back up to the strangers sitting in the sunlit atrium. I felt a profound, liberating emptiness. The heavy burden of seeking their validation, the suffocating guilt of never being enough, evaporated into the Maryland morning air. The transaction was complete. The ledger was balanced. You will do what you forced me to do 5 years ago, I replied. My tone carried the quiet grace of total detachment. You will figure it out entirely on your own. I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I did not linger to watch them drown in the consequences of their own choices. I began walking across the expansive lobby toward the sliding glass doors. The rhythmic clicking of my leather boots echoed through the atrium, a steady drumbeat marking the end of a grueling era. Nathan was waiting near the exit. He held 2 fresh coffees in his hands. His posture was relaxed, his dark eyes radiating an unspoken pride. As I approached, the automated glass doors slid open, allowing a rush of crisp, cool air to sweep into the sterile hospital environment. The thick fog outside had finally burned off, revealing a bright, unobstructed blue sky over the city of Baltimore. I reached out to take the coffee from my husband, ready to step out of the shadows and walk into the brilliant light of the life I had built. But just as my fingers brushed the warm cardboard sleeve of the cup, a sudden, piercing scream erupted from the intensive care wing upstairs, echoing down the elevator shafts and spilling into the main lobby, freezing the blood in my veins and signaling that the golden child had finally realized her fortress of lies was burning to the ground. The sharp, blood-curdling scream echoed down the elevator shaft, tearing through the quiet sunlit atrium like a physical blow. It was Paige. The sound was not born of physical agony. It was the distinct, piercing shriek of absolute, unrestrained fury. It was the sound of a woman who had just realized that her carefully constructed universe of privilege, deceit, and endless bailouts was finally, permanently collapsing around her. Charles flinched violently, his entire body jerking toward the elevators. The sound of his golden child in distress overrode the shock of his financial ruin for a fraction of a second. Linda gasped, covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with terror as she scrambled to her feet. They were conditioned to respond to her demands, trained to sprint toward every crisis she manufactured. But as Charles took a hesitant step toward the elevator banks, the reality of his situation anchored his feet to the terrazzo floor. He had no money. He had no leverage. He was standing in a hospital he was legally barred from threatening, holding the undeniable proof of his daughter's felony fraud. For the first time in his life, he possessed absolutely nothing to offer her. He looked at me, a silent, desperate plea flickering in his exhausted eyes. He wanted me to fix it. He wanted the capable, resilient daughter he had abused and discarded to step in and manage the catastrophe he had funded. I met his gaze with absolute, unyielding indifference. I did not offer a word of comfort. I did not offer a plan. I turned my back on the wreckage of my biological family and walked toward the sliding glass doors. The automatic doors parted with a quiet hum. The crisp, cool Maryland air washed over my face, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant salty tang of the Chesapeake Bay. The heavy metallic smell of the trauma center vanished, replaced by the profound clarity of a new morning. Nathan was waiting by the curb. He leaned against the passenger side of our sedan, holding 2 steaming paper cups. His dark eyes tracked my approach, reading the quiet resolution settling across my shoulders. He did not ask if I was okay. He knew the answer was yes. He handed me a cup. The heat of the coffee seeped through the cardboard sleeve, grounding me in the present moment. "It is over," I said quietly, my voice steady and clear. Nathan nodded, opening the passenger door for me. "I know. Let us go home." I slid into the leather seat. The door closed with a solid, comforting thud, sealing me inside a quiet sanctuary. Nathan walked around the front of the vehicle, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The quiet hum of the motor vibrated beneath my feet. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked out the passenger window. The massive glass facade of the medical center shrank in the side mirror. Somewhere deep inside that sprawling complex, my parents were standing in the lobby, surrounded by the spilled pages of their own ruin. They were trapped in a prison they had spent 5 years building, facing a future defined by bankruptcy, legal battles, and the relentless demands of a daughter who had manipulated them into profound poverty. They drained their retirement portfolio to fund a lie. Now Paige was permanently disabled, requiring round-the-clock care for a shattered pelvis. Because they had no money, they could not afford the luxury rehabilitation center in the mountains. They could not afford a private nurse. They could not even afford a standard care facility. They would be forced to bring her back to their cramped, heavily mortgaged house in Annapolis. They would spend their golden years acting as full-time caregivers for the very child who stole their wealth and destroyed their family. It was a devastating poetic justice. It was the exact unvarnished consequence of their choices. I turned away from the window, settling into the warmth of the car. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the grueling night shift finally dissipated, leaving a deep, peaceful exhaustion in its wake. The phantom weight I had carried in my chest for half a decade, the suffocating pressure of trying to prove my worth to people who viewed love as a finite resource, was completely gone. I took a slow sip of the coffee. The rich, dark roast tasted incredible. I watched the city of Baltimore roll past the window, the morning commute beginning in earnest. The world was waking up, entirely oblivious to the private war I had just won. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was an automated alert from the Credit Monitoring Bureau confirming that the hard freeze on my Social Security number was active. A second email notification arrived moments later from the Baltimore Police Department, acknowledging receipt of the formal fraud complaint. The digital fortress protecting my life was secure. Nathan merged onto the highway heading south toward our home. We lived in a quiet neighborhood near the water, far removed from the pristine, toxic perfection of Annapolis. We had built a life based on mutual respect, unwavering support, and brutal honesty. It was a life I had fought for, a life I had starved for, and a life I finally owned completely. I thought about the young woman I was 5 years ago, the terrified medical student standing in a granite kitchen, watching her future burn to the ground while her sister smiled. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that survival was not just possible, but inevitable. I wished I could tell her that the darkest, coldest nights spent sleeping in the back seat of a sedan would eventually forge a strength that no one could ever take away. But she already knew that. That strength was the only reason I was sitting in this car today. We drove in comfortable silence for a long time. The highway stretched out ahead of us, a ribbon of gray asphalt cutting through the rolling green hills of Maryland. "What are you thinking about?" Nathan asked quietly, his eyes on the road. I looked at my hands resting in my lap. My fingernails were trimmed short, practical and clean, entirely devoid of the long acrylic extensions my sister favored. They were the hands of a surgeon. They were the hands that had pulled her back from the edge of the grave and the hands that had delivered the final, undeniable truth. "I am thinking about dinner," I replied, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "I am craving something incredibly unhealthy, maybe a massive plate of pasta and a very expensive bottle of red wine." Nathan chuckled, a warm, resonant sound that filled the small space of the car. "I think that can be arranged. You definitely earned it." I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes. The sun warmed the side of my face through the glass. For the first time in 5 years, my mind was entirely quiet. There were no looming threats. There were no financial anxieties. There was no desperate need to prove my existence to ghosts. I was Dr. Tabitha Graham. I was a senior attending trauma physician. I was a wife. I was a survivor. And I was finally, truly free. The stories of Tabitha, Emma, and Claire are variations on a single devastating theme: the profound betrayal of a child by the very people tasked with their protection and guidance. In each narrative, we witness the systematic dismantling of a child's trust, not through malice, but through the toxic combination of entitlement, favoritism, and the treatment of love as a transactional currency. These narratives serve as a stark warning, demanding a rigorous reevaluation of the parenting values, family responsibilities, and the long-term guidance we provide to children within the American cultural landscape. The foundation of a healthy family structure, particularly within traditional models, rests upon honesty, fairness, and a deep emotional awareness. Yet in these stories, we see these pillars crumble under the weight of parental narcissism. Consider Tabitha's parents, Charles and Linda. Their failure wasn't simply believing Paige's malicious lie. It was the ease with which they embraced it. They didn't seek truth or clarity. They sought a convenient excuse to funnel their resources toward their preferred child. Their parenting was built on a foundation of intellectual dishonesty and a terrifying lack of emotional curiosity regarding their eldest daughter. This isn't mere favoritism. It's the weaponization of affection, demonstrating a profound failure to understand the fundamental responsibility of parenthood to nurture and protect all offspring equally, irrespective of their utility or compliance. Similarly, Emma's experience highlights the insidious nature of financial exploitation masked as family loyalty. Her parents prioritized a networking event over her spinal surgery, rationalizing their abandonment with the cold logic of investment returns. They viewed Emma not as a daughter in agonizing pain, but as an ATM, an endless resource to be drained for the benefit of her brother, Tyler. This reflects a disturbing trend where parents abdicate their responsibilities, shifting the burden of support onto a reliable child while indulging the irresponsibility of another. It's a failure of moral guidance, teaching children that their worth is intrinsically linked to what they can provide rather than who they are. Claire's story further illuminates this dynamic. Her parents consistently minimized her accomplishments and crises, dismissing her as the strong one who didn't require their attention, while simultaneously relying on her financial support. The $240 parking ticket, taking precedence over her emergency room visit, is a chilling testament to their skewed priorities. They didn't just fail to show up. They actively exploited her resilience, treating her love and loyalty as a given, a limited resource to be hoarded, while lavishing attention on her brother. This highlights a crucial failure in emotional awareness, the inability to recognize that even the strongest children require validation, support, and the fundamental assurance that they are valued for their mere existence, not their utility. In raising children, particularly within the complex fabric of modern American society, We must prioritize emotional intelligence and radical honesty. We must challenge the conventional wisdom that family takes care of family, when that care is profoundly unilateral and exploitative. True family responsibility means cultivating an environment where every child feels seen, heard, and valued equally. It means demonstrating integrity, holding ourselves accountable for our mistakes, and teaching our children that love is an action, not a birthright or a transaction. The guidance we provide must transcend simple financial support or superficial affection. It requires the hard work of emotional attunement, recognizing the unique needs and vulnerabilities of each child and responding with empathy and unwavering support. It means setting clear, healthy boundaries and teaching our children to do the same. When parents fail to model this behavior, they don't just damage the parent-child relationship, they cripple their children's ability to form healthy attachments and navigate the complexities of adult life. The ultimate tragedy in these stories is the realization that the parents never truly knew their children. They only knew the roles they had assigned them: the golden child, the ATM, the responsible one. They failed to see the vibrant, complex human being standing before them. The resolution in each narrative, the moment the protagonist finally sets an unbreakable boundary, is not an act of vindictiveness, but an act of profound self-preservation. It is the painful, necessary process of excising the toxic influence and choosing oneself. These stories, while heartbreaking, offer a powerful lesson in resilience and the necessity of self-advocacy. They challenge us to scrutinize our own familial relationships, to identify the subtle and not so subtle ways we may be perpetuating harmful dynamics. We must ask ourselves, are we loving our children for who they are, or for what they can do for us? Are we fostering an environment of genuine support or one of conditional affection? If these narratives resonate with you, if you see shadows of your own experiences reflected in the struggles of Tabitha, Emma, or Claire, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the Amanda Told Stories channel. Let us build a community dedicated to unearthing these difficult truths, to fostering emotional awareness, and to redefining what it truly means to be a family. The conventional wisdom dictates that blood is thicker than water, that family is an unbreakable bond deserving of endless forgiveness and sacrifice. But perhaps the most profound act of love, the most courageous assertion of our own humanity, is recognizing that sometimes the only way to save ourselves is to walk away. Perhaps true strength lies not in enduring the unbearable, but in having the radical audacity to demand what we are actually worth. When the ledger is finally balanced, we might discover that the greatest tragedy isn't the loss of a toxic family, but the years we spent believing their illusion. What if the very act of walking away is, in fact, the truest expression of the parenting they failed to provide us?